All right, go ahead, Ori. We're at 9:30.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us back. And for those who are here on your first day, thanks for being here. I'm Maureen Kelman. I'm a part of the facilitation team at Sac State with Megan Wiley and Tommy Emonson and Kara Taylor Hunt. We're all here to support this great 3-day event and really looking forward as we begin our second day. We just had a really nice networking opportunities to hear from everyone about what they took away from yesterday. And we're going to continue with that here in just a minute from Graham Fogg. But before that, I just want to cover a few logistical items. If you have any technical issues, please chat Tommy and he will provide you any needed support. We want to be able to connect with each other. So if possible, check your name in your Zoom window. Let us know who you are and your affiliation, and make sure that you're muted when not talking. So with that, just on the next slide, just want to offer some ways that we hope that we can all connect with each other and participate, and really encourage you to be part of the conversation today. We wish we could be in person together, but here we are on Zoom. And so feel free to raise your hand or use the chat box to ask questions, provide comments. We have programmed some Zoom poll questions and Mentimeter polls to get your input. The Zoom polls are going to be multiple choice, just a quick check the box. The Mentimeters is asking for your open or generally open-ended questions to just get a little bit more and hear from you. I don't think that we have any breakout sessions today, but we did yesterday and we will again tomorrow to allow some informal time together. We have some great on-demand content, so please feel free to check that out on your own. And we will have 2 sessions for happy hour this afternoon. So I want to encourage you to stay on for that, where we can really participate in conversations. With that, I'd like to introduce Graham Fogg, and he's going to kick us off today. Graham is a professor emeritus of hydrogeology and a hydrogeologist, and has more than 42 years experience researching and teaching about subsurface water flow, pollutant transport processes, and water resource sustainability. Graham taught courses at UC Davis in groundwater hydrology and modeling, applied geostatistics, and water resources. Much of Graham's research focuses on massive increases in groundwater storage through management of flood flows and exploitation of subsurface geologic features that maximizes opportunities for relatively rapid recharge. He has also worked extensively on modeling contaminant transport in groundwater, both at the plume and basin scales. And for all our presenter today, there is a more complete bio on the webpage, so feel free to learn more about our presenters today. But I think with Graham, that may not be necessary. We all know you, and you've been part of many of our Floodmark conversations. So I'll turn it to you.
Well, thank you so much, Ori. It's a real pleasure to be here. Yesterday was a beautiful day, so I have the easy task of summarizing it. I will do that. The question was asked by Jenny earlier. Do any of you have any concerns or things that you didn't see? And I almost spoke up there. I do have a couple of things to mention, but I'll make that part of a few slides that I'll show after I give a brief recap of yesterday and some reflections on it. My reflections will be at a 30,000 foot level primarily. And since today is really a lot of it about case studies, I'll give a couple of slides on highlights from a Floodmark case study that we did as part of the UC Water project. And what I want to do now is share my screen because I want to scroll through the agenda from yesterday. So,
Okay, Graham, so you'll run your own presentation from yours then, just to
yeah,
confirm? Yes, sir.
yes, please.
Okay. All right, hold on just a sec. Okay, you should have the capability of sharing your screen. There you go.
Okay, hopefully I'm sharing the web page that
You are,
has.
sir. Yes,
Yes.
you are.
Okay, so just to jog our memories on what happened yesterday, and for those who missed yesterday, when I said it was a beautiful day yesterday, I didn't mean the weather. I meant the conference, and most of us don't look forward to being on Zoom all day. But I have to say it was a relatively pleasurable day from that perspective. But we had a thought-provoking listening session with tribal representatives to start things off. I tried to visit all of these. In fact, I dipped into this pre-session 2 student and young professional networking, and they looked at me like, what do you mean? You're not a student. So that was kind of a student group. They seem to be doing quite well. I know all of those folks, so that was going well. And then the introduction I thought was perfect, from the video from Nathan Whalen to good old Don Cameron's recap of the early history, and Kamar's coverage of the basics of Floodmar was perfect. And then it was on to basically the Floodmar network. So this was an introduction, we hope, to the Floodmar network. And what we hope for this network is that it becomes the go-to place for people who want to do Floodmar. It's not really a network for professionals as much as it is a hub or a network to encourage and foster more Floodmar to happen down the road. So you saw, the communications plan, the work that's been done on assessing progress to date, starting from the priorities laid out by the Research Advisory Committee that Kamyar also talked about, to cultivating knowledge, to sharing information, and the hub that Aisha introduced is a brand new thing. So this is really the core of this Floodmar network, and I think we continue to want feedback on that, on how it's working. Do you see this as helpful? Is it going to be a resource for you moving forward, whether you're an implementer, a landowner, or a researcher? So, and then we got into day 1, topic 2 in the afternoon on cooperation and alignment. And this session, if anything, renewed my my faith that cooperation is a thing. And I think Tim Quinn almost convinced me that maybe we are into the age of cooperation. That's very, very encouraging, what I heard there. I also, this is where I saw some things come out that I want to amplify in some slides in a moment. But I thought each of these talks was right on in terms of what it takes to do cooperation, great examples of that. But maybe some notes come out of that in terms of questions on how sustainable this is. But my main question is, what will sustain this? And I think it's worth continuing to ask that. I'm not asking that as a curmudgeonly professor. We know some of those professors can be curmudgeonly, but I'm asking these as a way of making sure we're as strong as we can be moving into the future. And then in terms of optimism and hope for the future, that's I'm still a teacher and a researcher and a mentor of students, and I'm still co-mentoring some of these students right here. But this was and Jenny mentioned it earlier, a terrific set of lightning talks highlighting a lot of the research that's happening on Floodmar. And these projects range from research on water quality to research on water quantity and the bigger recharge picture, the mechanics of recharge, and really good good research projects on the water quality threats, which is definitely a need for new and emergent research. So it was a great way to close out the day, and I had a beer during that session, and it was a very good happy hour session overall. And today the watch term is going to be case studies. So I'll leave the introduction of the rest of today to Orit and others. But right now, what I'd like to do is to stop this share and put up some slides that I will share. Let me start the slides and get back to Zoom. Share my screen. Okay, so people should see the slides on my screen. Someone
Yes, sir. We could see your slides.
Perfect. Yeah, there's a laser. All right, so what I want to do here is, I think this is more important than perhaps some of us realize. What we're doing here, I think, is I'll say it again, perhaps more important than we realize. So I want to give some really broad, even global perspectives on this. So first off, let's talk about a global level. Groundwater stress is a global phenomenon. I think we all know this, that groundwater overstress, overdraft is not only a US societal problem or a California societal problem, this is a global problem. Globally, people are trying to come to grips with how to better manage groundwater, and the sustainability of the world food supply, our energy, really depends on this. That's why we talk a lot about the food, water, energy nexus. So this problem of better managing, and in particular, recharging groundwater is a big deal. Let me, the arrow is not advancing this slide. That's interesting. Let me try again. Oh, there we go. Okay. So, and just to recap, I think we all know there's only two ways to eliminate overdraft and most undesirable effects. That's decreased pumping or increased recharge. Now, we do need to decrease pumping in many instances, but it's arguable whether this world problem, this existential threat to water supply and food supply and so on, it's arguable whether you can decrease pumping enough to do it. And I would say there's emergent concepts and ideas that increasing recharge in ways that we perhaps hadn't imagined before is likely to be key to this. So let me step back and talk about groundwater in the arc of human history then. So I think it's worth thinking about it this way. Our ability to pump a lot of groundwater is relatively new. It's only within about the last 7 years we've had the technology and enough access to cheap energy to pump so much groundwater that we overdraft. Before that, we were just skimming off the tops of systems. Groundwater pumping is active. It's an active process. We have viewed groundwater recharge as mostly passive. Basically, what we've done is pump a lot of groundwater and hope for the best. That's what has been done across the world. That's why globally we're in this predicament. And I tweeted something out about this yesterday with a link to this forum, but imagine if we had devoted as much energy to recharging groundwater as to pumping it. Well, that would be a lot of energy. So maybe even if we devoted 20% of the energy to recharging as we do pumping it, how much better off would we be today in terms of groundwater? And that's the basic theme I'd like to emphasize in this little piece of my talk, is that I think we're at a moment in time where we're realizing we just ignored this too long. We really do need to put much more energy into recharging groundwater. And there's this paradox related to that. Although groundwater composes 97% of all liquid fresh water on Earth, our go-to method for water storage has been surface water. Well, there's obvious reasons for that, but it's worth asking, why is that? Nature stores most of its water underground. Why don't we? Why don't we use the subsurface that way? And here's a beautiful reservoir. Why is surface storage the norm? For centuries, it's been the only obvious choice. It's intuitive, right? Modern groundwater technology and science, or the science to really manage and fully utilize the subsurface reservoirs, is relatively young, less than about 60 years itself. The technology to operate systems like reservoirs, which is one thing we need to do. Floodmar is part of a strategy in which you're using the subsurface kind of like a reservoir. So it requires different strategies. It requires more monitoring, and it requires better models. Well, we have the technology to do that, but we really don't do it much. We're starting to, but I think we're at the beginning of a moment in time where this sort of thing is changing. So relative to that, let's just recap some key storage numbers for the Central Valley. And this comes from the Recharge Roundtable call to action document that we did in 2018, put out by UC Water and GRA. And the key numbers are 17, 42, 140. Jenny's a football fan, so it might sound like a football play, but basically historical snowpack, that's about 17 million acre feet. That's going away, not completely, but substantially. The reservoirs can store in California about 42 million acre feet total. And here's the one I like to emphasize. In the Central Valley subsurface, there's room for another 140 million acre feet because of overdraft, because of groundwater production. That's a conservative number. So there's more than 3 times as much available water space to store water in the Central Valley alone as all of the surface reservoirs in the state. This also should speak to us to say, well, we need to more fully utilize that space. Yes, there are water quality problems. I'm convinced they're entirely surmountable and manageable. Again, it's going to require different kinds of management than we've been accustomed to in the past. So yes, there'll be some research needs. I don't think the progress on these things has to wait entirely for all the research to be done. So here's a proposition. I'm proposing a way to think about these things. Globally increasing recharge and managing pumping is paramount. And if I'm getting up towards the end of my time, I guess I'm doing okay. Someone let me know. So these are paramount. For California conditions to do that, floodmar will be essential. The snowpack is going away. The surface reservoirs will continue to be essential for storage, but the management model that relies predominantly on surface reservoirs is becoming obsolete as the snowpack diminishes and climate change progresses. So betting on surface storage is problematic into the future. That's why for California, it's either cut back water use, not a lot, but dramatically, or institute floodmar and succeed at it. So floodmar will be essential. And the third bullet, there's a lot riding on our success in gaining full command of floodmar and California subsurface storage. So, and what I want to do next is tie this to what is the motivation that will keep this network and the floodmar process moving forward. There's incredible goodwill and enthusiasm in this group. But I'm a little worried that goodwill and enthusiasm might not be enough. So let me continue. And in terms of a more incisive summary of yesterday, well, this is beautiful. This word slide, the key ingredients for building successful partnerships and collaboration. And this followed the afternoon session where we had those incredible examples of successful collaboration and detailed, substantial examples of success through collaboration for water resources and other problems. And of course, trust, empathy, communication, listening, willingness, these were the key watch phrases. There's leadership, and I'll come back to that. The one I put up was mutually shared reality. I do worry about this. And we operate these days in a situation where there's a lot of division because people can't seem to share the same quote unquote reality. Reality should be in quotes because it's reality is also subjective. So that's an issue. Money is mentioned here. Money is right there. And I think funding is another word in here. But I think what was meant by money here was, money can be a way of stimulating collaboration. I think the money is important, but I have a different take on that I'll mention here in a moment. So, this is a really good summary. What's missing? When I look at this, I was thinking about it last night. I was thinking about it this morning. When I watch a really good movie and the next morning I wake up and it's the first thing I think about, it was a good movie. So that also tells me yesterday was pretty good because I woke up this morning still thinking about it. Of course, I was working on these slides into the night, so that might have had something to do with it too. But anyway, yeah, there's something that I don't see here that that I'm going to throw out here as a way of just perhaps stimulating further discussion through the day. And that's the idea of motivation and incentives. And one reason I worry about this is this key fact that I like to remind students and others of. Recharge is local, but recharge benefits are regional and grow with time. So I firmly believe that for Floodmar to work at the appropriate scale to help California balance its water imbalances, you need to do it on a landscape scale. That means doing it across thousands of parcels of land, which likely means engaging and motivating and working with hundreds to thousands of landowners. Now, those landowners are going to eventually figure out that much of the recharge that they do does not benefit them directly. It benefits more the region. Again, I go back to this point. Recharge is local, but the recharge benefits are regional. So how are you going to keep folks like them engaged and willing to make the sacrifice, because there is some sacrifice that'll be necessary to motivate the recharge. And so it's summarized here. How do you incentivize hundreds of thousands of people to voluntarily collaborate in Floodmar? What we saw yesterday was energy and goodwill. Is that enough to make it happen? Well, if it is, that's great, but I'm not so sure. I think we want to make sure we don't screw this up and ask the appropriate questions on what's going to work moving forward. Moreover, how do you incentivize people to voluntarily reduce their groundwater pumping? Because that needs to happen too. And we like to think we can minimize that by increasing recharge, but in reality, both of these things have to happen. But it's also true that we must use the subsurface reservoir more and better. So here's a suggestion, and this relates back to the money. My suggestion is, and I'm going to use the F word here, sorry, GSA's charge twice. That's maybe that's Freudian. GSA's charge pumping fees. That's the F word, and discount those fees by amounts recharged. In other words, if you're paying by how much you pump, that helps incentivize managing your pumping. But if you get a discount off your pumping bill by how much you recharge or simply how much you infiltrate, without even trying to measure recharge, which is almost unobservable at certain scales, can you then use this economic structure to manage not only the pumping, but the recharge. So this is the same thing as the recharge net metering model of Andy Fisher of UC Santa Cruz, who elucidated this plan through his work in the UC Water Network and other research projects at Pajaro Water District. So I think, and this is also perhaps where, and this is referred to yesterday, where the role of government can come in too, because this came up in the last session yesterday. So in other words here, just to summarize what I just said, the GSAs, I think, need sustainable funding models. And we heard this in the last session. Matt Zadar lamented this. Gary Bardini alluded to it. And I can't remember the name right now, but the others in that session mentioned this, that the problem of funding. This network itself doesn't have much funding. It's a shoestring. It's calling on volunteers to design the website. So there is a funding problem. For the GSAs in particular, I think they need sustainable funding models. There's a session tomorrow that I believe will help address this. So, and going back to the word slide here, and all this goodwill, this communication, the age of cooperation. I highlighted this comment that came out at 4:09 p.m. yesterday from Justin Fredrickson of the California Farm Bureau to everyone. And I asked myself, is this a cautionary tale? And this was a question to Tim, or a comment. To harken back to another collaborative process of the past, CalFed's refrain in the late 1990s and early 2000s was everyone gets better together. There was tremendous goodwill there. There was good energy. A lot of people were on the same page in terms of objectives. Lots of collaborative visioning was done for this. And this was probably everyone's, at least most parties, sincere aspiration. But when unexpected reality came to a head, POD, fish crisis, BIOPS, implosion of EWA, et cetera, everything fell apart. How do you maintain and actually realize the goodwill, even in the face of unexpected harsh realities? And Tim Quinn's response was good, but basically, I think I understood him to say that, well, yeah, but the problem was the federal government and Department of Interior, Secretary of Interior pulled out. I think it was because of administrative change. So that government leadership that wasn't directing everything, I don't think it was a top-down direction, but a key sort of linchpin was removed. And then this kind of concern also came out in Tim's slide right here that I've taken the opportunity to borrow. Whereas number 5 pointed out consistent local, state, and federal policy strategies to align local, state, and federal policies. And this morning, Daniel Mountjoy at the coffee hour mentioned this, that there's a need for, the state can't totally take its hands off the wheel here. It needs to have at least one hand on the wheel. It needs to be involved in key ways, and we need to consider, what help do we need from the state? We understand the state doesn't want to make this top down, but there's a key role for the state, and if you don't have it, there's potential that things won't work. Gary Bardini also pointed this out in his slide, his item number 12 on local, state, and federal policies and legal considerations. And this is where I'm thinking, going back to that funding model for GSAs, I think the GSAs need help. And I'm assuming some of this help should come from the state in figuring out how to get to funding models that allow the necessary work on the groundwater and recharge and flood to happen. Because there will be a need for monetary compensation, I think, ultimately, for those who initiate major recharge projects. So I'm at the end of the hour. I have some slides here, end of the half hour, for my David Keith Todd lecture, which a lot of you probably heard, highlighting the American Casumnas floodmar project that in which we made a number of advancements on reservoir operation, groundwater characterization, and optimization modeling of a groundwater basin. And I'm not going to go into them because I've run out of time, but suffice it to say, the key take home here is that we found unequivocally that you can put a lot of water away here by remanaging the reservoir, remanaging the groundwater system, and having the right control of the land and the water. And in this system, that appears to be quite possible. And the way, and I'll close with one thing: if you're trying to make people enthusiastic or come on board on the floodmar process, here's how I pitch it to folks in this area. If you could have another Folsom Lake in this system that stores about as much water as the capacity of Folsom Lake, but doesn't have the costly price tag, it doesn't have the environmental negative impacts that Folsom Lake would, another Folsom Lake, would you want it? And the answer is, of course. And the punchline, of course, is that in this region of southern Sacramento County, there is enough room to do that. There's enough room, and there are the conditions to recharge groundwater through floodmar and other recharge processes to essentially create another Folsom Lake right here. So I'll end it there, and hopefully I've stimulated some conversation that can carry on through the rest of the day. But I will stop it there, and I will stop my share after I turn off the laser pointer.
This was great. Thanks, Graham. And it's fine that we are running out of time, as this was incredibly important setting up for today. I really appreciate the overview and the highlights from yesterday, and just more generally, just the problem statement, and a reminder that the enthusiasm and goodwill is great, but we need to bolster that and make sure that we are all contributing to moving that forward in different ways, and really appreciate your thoughts on that. I'm going to steal the tagline from our Almond Board video that we saw before we officially started, of being part of the solution. And I think we're going to hear a lot about that today. So really looking forward. There is a QR code that if you were not here for the informal networking this morning, if you want to share your takeaways, would love to hear from you. And you can continue and contribute to this, and we'll come back to this at maybe lunchtime, Tommy. We can bring it back. I want to talk a little bit about today's agenda, which is on our next slide. And I'm going to turn it over to David Arata in just a minute. We are spending our morning hearing about the Merced River Watershed Study. And we have a whole set of presentation that the team is going to share. We're going to take a short break halfway through it. And there will be no real time for Q&A. This is just going to be a lot of learning and listening. But we did set up time during our happy hour today at 4:15 for an informal conversation with the Merced Study team. So please stay on for the 4:15 hour for that conversation, where we can ask questions and have a discussion. You can, of course, continue and add questions and comments in the chat for the team throughout the day. We have lunch from 12:30 to 2. Today, we're just going to take a break for that time, and then come back at 2 o'clock for great examples of projects, pilots, and research studies. And we'll see if we have time for a breakout today. hoping to find time for discussions throughout the day with all the content that we wanted to cover. And with that, I think on the next slide, I can go ahead and introduce David.
Rita, I'm going to transition to the other slide deck.
Okay.
And I'll bring that slide up, but you can go
No
ahead and keep
problem. I
talking.
will not waste any time. David Arade is the supervisor of the Integrated Modeling Unit in the Statewide Infrastructure Investigation Branch, which is part of the Division of Planning at DWR. Over the past 15 years, he has worked on a variety of planning and technical studies and is currently leading the Merced River Floodmar Reconnaissance Study. So I'm going to turn it over to you, David, and listen in.
Thank you, Orit. Thanks for the introduction. We have a lot of content to cover. We've got quite a few presenters and a lot of information on the Merced study, so I'm going to keep things moving here pretty quick. And as Orit said, we won't have time for questions, but we do have that kind of Q&A session this afternoon. And let me see if I have control here. There we go. Okay, great. So yeah, so the next 2.5 hours, we're going to be spending on the Merced River Watershed Study. This is a study that the department's been working on for quite some time now, but we are getting close to wrapping up. We are wrapping up our technical work, the modeling, probably by the end of this year. And then for the next few months after that, it'll be working on wrapping up results and putting out documentation. So I'm excited that this study is almost done. So let me go and move forward here. So since we have so many presenters and not a lot of time, I'm just going to quickly introduce who all the presenters are. So I got myself, I'll be presenting on the intro here and a flood benefits section later on. Lee Bergfeld from MBK Engineers will be presenting on the physical water available for recharge. Danny Mountainjoy from Sustainable Conservation is going to present on how that available recharge water is allocated across potential recharge sites. Liz DeBramo from Woodard and Kern will present on the fate of that recharge water and the subsequent groundwater supply benefits. Paul Bergman from Environmental Science Associates will present on the potential ecosystem effects from floodmar implementation. And then Karandeep Singh from DWR will be presenting on the multi-sector performance and trade-offs, kind of the higher level metrics and results that we're generating out of this study. And then we'll have Hisham Atal from Merced Irrigation District, who give us kind of a local perspective as a local participant on a watershed study. And then Jim Weeking, my supervisor from DWR, will wrap it all up with some reflections and next steps. So let's go ahead and go forward. All right. And let's see if I can get, yes, there we go. Okay, so some background on the Merced watershed. So this is our study area. It's the entire Merced watershed, and some of the smaller creek watersheds are also included. We have one major reservoir, Lake McClure, impounded by New Exchequer Dam. There's about 862 miles of conveyance within the MID, Merced Irrigation District Service District. Most of it comes off of the main canal, which feeds the Merced subbasin area here, and they do also have a small north side canal that feeds a small area kind of to the north of the Merced River. There's about 130,000 acres of agricultural land within their district. Again, most of it's in the Merced subbasin, with a little bit being accessed in the Turlock subbasin through the Merced Canal. So the purpose and goals of this study, the main purpose of this study is a proof of concept study for implementing floodmar at the watershed scale, and really trying to integrate all these sectors of water resource management at the watershed scale. In ways we're trying to do that, some of the goals through the study is this integrated watershed modeling, bringing all the models together: groundwater, surface water, flood, water supply, ecosystem, trying to bring that all together into one watershed, one model tool set to be able to view it all at once and really look at that concept of floodmar and how does it affect everything in a watershed. We're assessing climate vulnerability to the watershed. We'll get into that in a little bit of detail, and then the adaptation potential of floodmar. We'll be evaluating those multi-sector effects on flood, water supply, ecosystem, groundwater, all those, looking at the effects, benefits, and trade-offs. We'll kind of touch on those points a lot throughout this session, is effects, benefits, trade-offs. And ultimately, we really hope that this study can be a goal, can be a template for future studies and projects, not just within DWR, but outside of DWR, people can hopefully use the information, the modeling information, the tech memos that we're going to put out. They can use all that to start somewhere further down the line than where we started. We started at square one, really had to spend a lot of time just figuring out how to do this. We're hoping that information can be very helpful for others. So I'm going to go real quick through the model integration. This isn't a technical session. We're trying to focus more just on the benefits and effects of flood-mar on the watershed, but I'll just kind of run through the models real quick. We have 9 different models to be able to look at that whole watershed. This flow chart here really shows how they all interconnect, but let's look at them kind of a little more spatially. So even though our study area is in kind of this orange area here, we do go beyond the study area because of the groundwater system. And I think Graham actually touched on this really well. You know, recharge is local, but the effects are regional. And what happens in the Merced subbasin affects the neighboring subbasins, and what happens in the neighboring subbasins affects the Merced subbasin. So our groundwater model goes out beyond the Merced subbasin. So we have some watershed runoff models that help feed into that. We use Cal Light to be able to look at delta conditions. We look at delta conditions to see if the delta is in excess, and that is a trigger, one of the triggers for when flood-mar can happen, is if delta is in excess conditions. Now, as we drill down closer into our watershed, we've got a number of models here. Again, we've got watershed runoff models. We have a reservoir operations model. This has all the reservoir operations, flood operations, water supply, any ecosystem, minimum flow requirements. And for our flood-mar scenarios, it has all of our flood-mar operations built into it as well. We do look at a number of the smaller creeks within the Merced subbasin. There's Bear, Mariposa, Owens, I believe, Black Rascal. So we have a watershed runoff models for those creeks as well. And all of that feeds into the groundwater model. For flood-mar, we've got another model in between. A lot of you probably have heard of it, the GRAT tool, recharge optimization. This figures out, you know, where can we take that water that is available and spread it out throughout the MID service area before it goes into the groundwater model. And then lastly, we've got flood models. It's in the name, flood-mar. So we look at the flood effects. What does flood-mar do to decrease peak flows in the rivers and in the creeks? So we've got a set of models that model that, and also look at the flood damages. We have an FIA model that we've set up to look at flood damages. So climate change is very important, obviously. And typically DWR studies have looked at maybe 1 or 2 scenarios for climate change. We want to try to do something different. Our DWR climate change group has been working on this decision scaling or risk-based approach, where we try to look at all the potential climate change futures. So how do we do that? We have 100 years of continuous hydrology. It is simulated, but it is based on a historical, it's kind of a recreated, simulated historical recreation from 1900 and 1999. We look at 30 scenarios. So we perturb our changes in temperature from 0 to 4 degrees in 1 degree increments. And we perturb the changes in precipitation from -20 to +30% in 10% increments. So each of these dots on this grid is 100 years of hydrology that's perturbed by a certain amount of change in temperature and a certain change in precipitation. And we run each of those scenarios through our models. That's 30 scenarios, 100 years, all run through these models. So then we can generate some information like this, where we can look at how does a certain metric get affected by all of these climate change features. So here we stick with somewhat of a simple one. We look at average runoff into the Merced Basin from November to March. It's kind of our flood-mar time period. In baseline, that average is about 434,000 acre feet. That would be right here, current climate. As we increase temperature, and especially as we increase precipitation, more runoff is coming in that time period. If we did a version of this that went from April to October, you know, the other months, it would be kind of a flip where we would see a lot less runoff happening on more of this chart. As we know, a lot of times with climate change, that runoff is moving more into the early spring, late winter time period. So for simplicity for today's presentation, though, trying to show 30 different results, or something that we're trying to do is this risk-based, where we use probability of, you know, how probable a certain future is, what kind of expected values we get. We don't have time to go into that kind of detail. So we're just going to show results from 2 different climate scenarios, the current climate and this 2040 conditional probability climate. We have a 50% confidence interval that 2040 would be in here. So we picked 2 degrees change in temperature and plus 10 degrees change in precipitation. So a warmer, slightly wetter climate. That'll be the future climate that you'll see described in more presentations throughout. So these are the two, our baseline and our future. As we eventually get through more results and other presentations and wrap up, we'll have more of a risk-based approach to how we present these results. So what are we doing with this study as far as baseline and floodmar? So we have a baseline climate vulnerability analysis using all those models, looking at how the Merced watershed is vulnerable to climate change, using all that climate change, looking at surface water, flood, groundwater, ecosystem, all those metrics. And then for floodmar implementation scenarios, we have 3 levels of scenarios that we're looking at. Our first is just recharge using excess flows. This just uses the existing infrastructure of the MID system, their existing canal, just fitting floodmar operations around their existing operations and basically skimming flows off of the Merced River, off of the creeks, and doing floodmar. We then build on that and we add reservoir reoperation. So this gets a little more advanced now. We've got reservoir reoperation. We look at things like FERO or recharge pool concept. I'll get into those more in a second. And now we start doing some emphasis on how we are managing that water, how we were targeting that recharge. And Daniel Mountjoy will get a little more detail in his presentation on that. And then lastly, we build on top of that, looking at infrastructure improvements. So we're using existing infrastructure, reservoir operations, targeted recharge, and any kind of infrastructure improvements, looking at bottlenecks in the MID's canal system, floodplain, inundation, setback areas, additional recharge basins, those kind of ideas. Going a little deeper into these floodmar implementation scenarios, each of these kind of levels has 3 scenarios within it, a couple of kind of bookends and it's something in the middle or just some different types of operations. So this table is going to be used throughout the rest of the session to kind of show you what exactly we're going to be presenting in each presentation. Different presentations will focus on certain scenarios. So we have in our recharge using excess flow, we have a canal only scenario where we just use the canal, no on farm, just use the canal as sort of a pseudo recharge basin. We have a canal with on farm, so now we are doing on farm recharge. And then we have something we call the maximum canal and on farm. Lee will get into a little more detail on this in his section. For reservoir reoperations, we look at a FERO concept. So for FERO, we just real quick here, we've got a rule curve of the reservoir. The black line is kind of the rule curve of how the reservoir storage should be. So during the flood period, that curve comes down to open up flood space. With FERO, we allow it to encroach about 50,000 acre feet into that flood space and try to meter flows out a little bit more and control how the reservoir is releasing and doing floodmar at the same time. On the other side of that, we have a recharge pool concept where at the beginning of the flood season, we draw down the reservoir 100,000 acre feet, move that water directly for floodmar recharge. So it's all put into the groundwater basin. And we've now opened up additional flood space. So we'll get more details though as we go through the presentations. And then the last level just adds some infrastructure improvements on these. So some key messages for the study and this presentation as a whole. These study results communicate to different water sectors. It's communicating to surface water, groundwater, flood, ecosystem, and they're all interacting. What happens in one sector really does affect another one. We've really seen that through the integrated modeling, and when floodmar starts to get implemented, it starts to affect everything. And we really need to start thinking of it that way. We can't be in our silos anymore. We need to get all water managers together and really working together. I think that's been a message throughout this forum so far. This common hydrology and integrated modeling toolset really facilitates a consistent exploration of effects and trade-offs across all sectors. We just talked about these are all the sectors affected. With this common hydrology for all the models, all water sectors, we can really see how everything's interacting, what the effects are, what the trade-offs are from one sector to another. This study is designed to showcase enough floodmar, but not optimize it. We're not looking for the best solution of floodmar in the Merced subbasin. We're not there yet. The idea was let's investigate a whole bunch of different concepts of floodmar that could be implemented. Like as I said earlier, the main goal of the study was it was a proof of concept study. And this is what we're showcasing. And then lastly, adaptation strategies address both existing and future vulnerabilities. And we're going to see that more as we go through more of these presentations as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Lee Bergfeld now. He's going to present his part on water available for recharge. Thank you.
Right, thanks, David. Let's see here if I've got.
Give me just a second, Lee. I'm going to remove spotlight for David and add you as a spotlight here. There we go. Okay, Lee, give it a try, please.
Right,
There it goes. You are moving the mouse.
okay. Let's see if I can advance the screen. Yeah, there we go. First polling question here on the screen, just to kind of get a sense of what folks think might be the average annual water available for recharge. You want to take your shot at that and answer, and I'm going to go ahead and get started in terms of walking through presentation. There we go. Okay, so as David alluded to, these are the different scenarios that we're looking at, and I'm going to speak specifically about these 6 where we've got green check marks, primarily focusing on recharge using excess flows and one of our recharge plus reservoir operations scenarios. So when we think about water available for recharge, this is kind of the key ingredient in Floodmore, and I think about it that way for both sides of the hyphen in the term Floodmore. On the flood side, this is the water that we've got to try to deal with because it's in excess of what we can manage safely within our system. So it's the excess that we're trying to find a home for. And on the MAR side, obviously, there's not a lot of recharge that occurs without some water to make it happen. So as we define this availability of water, there's a number of different factors that can affect it. What's the source of the water that we're looking at? When are we looking to divert water? What's the location? And we've got to consider some other things that are like the existing water rights so that we're not impacting others, and the needs of the environment so that we're not diverting water to the detriment of the environment. On the Merced study, to define some of these different factors, we're looking at multiple different sources. The first is the Merced River, and then we're also looking at some east side streams where water comes in from the foothills in largely unregulated smaller streams that flow into Merced Irrigation District. So those are our sources. In terms of the season, we're looking at the flood management season from November through March. And as David alluded to, we're talking about existing diversion locations. And then in terms of what water is available, we're looking at 2 primary strategies. The first are the excess flows, and we need to define thresholds to say, what do we mean by, quote, excess water within the system? And we have to think about the environmental needs in those existing water rights that I mentioned. We'll get into how we did that in this study here in the next few slides. And then another strategy is to think about using water that's currently stored in the reservoir as another source of water that we could use for recharge, vacate some of the space, and that might provide some additional flood control benefits. So when we talk about defining the excess flows on the Merced River, we looked at 3 different scenarios, and David kind of went through those from canal only to kind of max canal and on farm. But within those different titles, there's also a different definition of excess flow on the Merced River. So some folks might be aware that the State Water Resources Control Board has a streamlined application process for those who are interested in applying for a new water right for groundwater recharge. And that streamlined process has the 3 criteria, primarily these 3 that are summarized here on this slide. You've got to be looking to divert the water from December 1st through March 31st. So during the winter time, the stream flow needs to exceed the daily 90th percentile flows or whatever stream that you're looking to divert from at the location. And you don't divert more than 20% of the total flow at any one time. And I will say there's another criteria, not here on the slide, that kind of is in lieu of the 90th percentile on a daily basis. And that is if you're only going to divert water during periods when the flows are going to trigger a flood control action, or a flood control agency says that it's kind of a dedicated or a designated flood control period. So we looked at one scenario where we define the excess according to the streamlined water right application permit conditions. And then we looked at two different alternatives. One, we expanded the month, the period or the season to include the month of November. And instead of using the daily 90th percentile, we use the monthly 90th percentile. This is simply a little bit less conservative of a way to define excess flows, and could still be possible if instead of going and pursuing a streamlined water right application, you were to pursue an application just under the standard application process. And then the last alternative is simply bypassing the first 500 CFS of flow in the Merced River as kind of the requirement to meet the environmental needs and downstream water rights within the system during the November 1 through March 31st period. So this is kind of the least restrictive definition of excess flows for the Merced. On all three of the alternatives, we looked at the delta conditions as well. And so for those who might not be familiar, a delta excess condition essentially means that the two large projects that are diverting water out of the South Delta, the Federal Central Valley Project and the State Water Project, have declared that there's enough water in the system for them to take all that they would be normally taking under their water rights. So this delta excess condition was a condition that was a surrogate for assuming that the water rights within the system were being satisfied. So we applied that in our availability or our definition of excess flows for the Merced River. Then on the east side streams, we had some similar processes where we tried to define the excess. So one criteria was the daily 90th percentile December through March. We ran a second one where we looked at the monthly 90th percentile November through March, excuse me, the dailies December through March. And then we also looked at downstream water rights on these east side streams and made sure that we were bypassing or not diverting the maximum of either the 90th percentile flow or the downstream rights. And again, we applied a condition of the delta being in excess as a surrogate for satisfying the existing rights within the system, and only defined water above this as our excess water that might be available for recharge. Then the second strategy that I mentioned is a reservoir reoperation. And this is a little different because everything in the definition of excess is really thinking about taking advantage of the targets of opportunity. We've got high flows in the system based on how it's currently managed and operated that could be creating a flood control challenge for us and providing an opportunity as a source of water for recharge. But we started thinking beyond that a little bit and said, what about this water that was previously stored and is being held in a reservoir? We could use potentially some of that water as a source for recharge. But of course, we'd want to kind of think about that and think about the times and the conditions under which we want to withdraw some of that water to put it in the ground. For example, you wouldn't want to, in most cases, take kind of the last bit of water that was in your reservoir above a dead pool condition and put it in the ground if you had a lot of space to store available surface water. But if you're kind of near the top of that conservation pool and going to have to release water for flood control purposes in the near future, that might be some water under these high storage conditions that you might think about putting into the ground. If you do that, you're going to vacate the space in the reservoir. That's going to create a flood control benefit. But we also thought about how that might be tracked and looked at into the future, because you might have to be able to only refill that during a future excess condition to ensure that you're protecting water rights downstream. So a key message here is written on the bottom of the slide. The use of a reservoir really expands when and how much water could be available for recharge, and we'll get into that with some of the results. And so here are some of the results in terms of the water available for recharge. So you can see the bars kind of going up. So all of these, the first 3 bars are under just the definition of excess flow. So the canal only, this is our streamlined water right application threshold criteria. So these are the highest, the most conservative diversion thresholds that we have. And you can see what that looks like in terms of relative contributions of Merced River and the east side streams. As we move to the canal plus on farm, then we've got more water available. So as we kind of relax this definition of what are the excess flows within the system, it changes the volume and the frequency of the water that's available for recharge. We get out to the max canal and on farm, this has our lowest diversion threshold. And you can see that the bars keep getting larger. And then the last one on the right is a moderate diversion threshold, plus the use of that previously stored water under some conditions when our storage in our reservoir is high. So we look to move that water out of the reservoir and recharge it within the aquifer. So I have to admit that this morning, as I was reviewing the slides, I had an oh shoot moment, because I looked at this, the y-axis label saying average annual water available for replenishment in million of acre feet. And I thought, this can't be right. So I'd like to say that I did this to throw you off as you were answering that polling question at the start, because as David said, the average runoff of the Merced during the November through March period is around 435,000 acre feet. So what these volumes actually represent in million of acre feet is the total volumes of water available for recharge throughout the 100-year simulation period. So an easy conversion factor here is to just multiply it by 10, and now we have it in thousands of acre feet on an average annual basis. So under this high diversion threshold, the volume is around 17,000 acre feet, and out here on the right side, we have an average annual water available for replenishment or recharge of about 100,000 acre feet. And I should point out that these are limited by the existing diversion capacity. So it could be that there's a lot more water available, say flowing down the Merced River, but we've limited by the capacity that we can currently divert. So I'll move to my last slide here, or second to last slide. This is water available for recharge and climate change. As David talked about before with some of the scenarios in our future climate condition, we get more of the runoff on the Merced River and the streams in that November through March period. So you can see that there's actually more water predicted to be available in the future as the climate warms and potentially we get more precipitation. And then the last slide here to kind of wrap this up of water available for recharge and water rights. So the study really focuses on water that's physically available, but we do make some considerations in terms of what is needed to protect the environment downstream in terms of minimum flows and bypass criteria. We use the delta excess condition as a surrogate for assuming that the other water rights within the system are being satisfied, and also look at some of the existing rights on the east side streams. But the water that we've analyzed and have summarized here in those last couple of slides is more the physical available. It's not necessarily the legally available water within the system. So I think a lot of folks who are actively engaged in pursuing flood-mar projects recognize that water rights are a pretty key part of having water be available to divert and recharge the aquifer. And I'll just say that a more rigorous analysis of the water that would be legally available may be required if you're going to pursue an application for a new water right to divert and have a flood-mar project. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to David to introduce the next speaker.
Thanks, Lee. So our next speaker is going to be Daniel Mountjoy. He's going to present on where we put that recharge water now. But just before, sorry, Lee, don't go away just yet. As Tony transitions the control over Daniel, can you reflect real quick on how the poll results compared to our results, and what do people think? What do we think?
And I'm sharing the results so you guys can see it.
All
So I think the good news here, right, is that everybody's right. It depends on your definition of excess flow. Because, right, at our most conservative, we were at 17,000 acre feet on an average annual basis. And when we are less conservative and we incorporate the reservoirs, it gets even better.
Thanks, Lee. It's always great when everybody's right. All right, so we'll go ahead and move on to Daniel now. Go ahead,
Okay,
Daniel.
great. See if the slides will advance here.
Showing you have control, Daniel, so just give it a couple clicks. So I'm going to move the mouse over to the left here. So you
Okay.
are moving it, and left click should advance it and move the mouse around. I see it moving.
Still not moving. Maybe take a minute longer here.
The arrows seem to work a little better.
There we go. All right, so the second part is David illustrated in those models is taking a look at where we can put all that water that Lee was describing under the different scenarios. And we do have another poll question for you here, asking on average, what % of the water available for recharge that Lee just showed can actually be recharged using that current conveyance canal system and farmland? In other words, do we have the potential without reservoir reoperations and without expanding canals to capture much of that water in the Merced system? And while you guys are answering the poll, it's great. I'm seeing the numbers coming in. I'm not going to reveal the answer yet. So similar to Lee, I'm going to show that a little later on in the presentation and see where your numbers come out. But what I'm seeing is, at least preliminary results are that many of you are thinking that it's less than 50% or 50 to 75%. So we'll come back to that and talk about what's possible.
And Daniel, just to double check, is it okay to leave the poll open for a little while?
Sure.
Or do you want me
Yeah.
to? Okay, great.
You can leave the poll
We will leave it open. Thank you.
and people can shift it to the side so you can see the screen.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay. And still trying to get the slide to advance now. Wonder, do I need to close my screen? Let's see to get that to go.
So if you just move your mouse a little bit more to the left, Daniel, and then I see you moving it. So if you click, it should advance it.
Yeah, there we go.
There it goes.
Okay, so then using the same diagram that was introduced by David, I'm first going to share with you all how much recharge can we do on the canal and on farm under both current climate and future climate scenarios. So when we think about how that water available for recharge can be allocated across an irrigation district's fields and lands, there's some really important questions that may or may not limit our capacity for recharge. And there are 4 factors that I'm going to talk about that really are key for any recharge planning effort to think about when you're thinking about flood-mar, especially when it's on agricultural lands. The first is the daily availability of water that Lee talked about. The second is the diversion and conveyance capacity of the irrigation district to actually move that water. And as Lee mentioned, the canal capacity may be the limiting factor. Third is, what's the hydrogeologic site suitability of a given field? And then finally, the crop compatibility. Now, these do not represent growers' willingness to participate, nor incentives for participating, but we'll be talking about, what's the potential. And these factors, some of them are spatial, as in where and how much water can you move within the system, and what's the site suitability, and others are more temporal around the daily availability of that water and the crop condition at the time that water is available, and whether you can actually apply it on those. So this is what we're going to be talking about, is a spatial and temporal integration of these different factors. The first one really affects the availability of that water. This is looking at the daily availability over 100 years from all the 6 water sources, being the Merced River and then the smaller streams. And you can see that in a lot of days, there's extreme high amounts of water, 5,000 CFS, acre feet in a single day. Other times it's down at nothing or very low amounts. So it's those peaks that really matter. And then when we look at it actually in a given year, we can see how these events occur in sort of episodic peaks and then dry periods. And so as we're looking at where we can put water, what's going to be critical is, can we capture in a big gulp these larger amounts? And then in smaller events, where do we put the smaller amounts to optimize where that goes? The district canals really determine, as I said, how much water can be applied and where. And these arrows indicate the different sources of where the water comes into the system, off the Merced River itself, and then the smaller streams coming into the district. And these are all existing diversions that the district has managed and maintained over the years. Now, each of those diversion points, again shown in these separate slides, can only go to certain fields. The Merced River diversions can go to all the fields in the district, but some of these smaller streams can only go to certain portions of the district fields, shown in different colors here from each of the different streams. So this is a big spatial analytic question about how do we move water off these streams and find fields where the crop is suitable, the land is suitable, and where there's canal capacity to move it to all those fields. These are the operational questions that an irrigation district has to think through when considering implementing a FLEDMAR project. And then, as I mentioned, all those sites then have different hydrogeologic site suitability. And we're using, for this model, a method or an index developed by LandIQ, looking at an integration of a combination of soils, permeability, depth to groundwater, and then subsurface permeability from USGS, Central Valley Hydrologic Model. And what we see is there's different portions of the district with different suitability. And when you drill into each of these regions, there's very different field differences from field to field, and even portions of fields have different soil conditions. And then the fourth factor, as I mentioned, is crop compatibility. And a number of folks have been doing research and evaluating and testing, piloting different crops to see how well they do under different recharge scenarios. And Don Cameron certainly has tried most of these. Helen Dahlke has done a number of really in-depth studies on this with her colleagues at UC Davis. And we have partial information now about how much each of these crops can take. But for the purpose of this study, we then used all of those perennial crops that have a dormant season, as well as annual crops that have a time period in which the field is fallow during that November through March time period, as highlighted here in green. And then for each soil and crop combination, we used DWR's irrigation demand calculator to look at how much water we could apply on those soils without causing saturation in excess of 75%, which in the literature seems to be a somewhat of a reasonable threshold to use for avoiding loss of oxygen in the soil profile for root health. So in this case, what you see is only about 5 days of application of water to a given field, in this case, alfalfa on sandy loam, then followed by a shutting off the water because we started to approach the 75% saturation level, here being saturation line, and then let it dry down. And dry down is a function of both the soil's drainage capacity as well as the evapotranspiration of the crop at the time at which the water is applied. From all of that, we developed a crop calendar, which looks at these periods of application in green, followed by a dry down period, followed by more application on the perennial crops, and then on fallow periods being solid green during the period in which those fields are empty during that winter period. And all of these integrate as well, both the crop biological considerations, such as almonds, you don't put water on after the bloom, or management activities allowing for some time off for pruning during the winter or winter spraying. So all of that's integrated into a crop calendar. And the key message from this is we need to schedule recharge safely around agricultural practices and crop health needs. And this is really a message for the agricultural community. Farmers will tell you this, and we've interviewed dozens of farmers about this, that these factors need to be taken into consideration. Not all sites and not all crops can take water in the same quantities at the same time, and they really are soil dependent. So we then take this information through the groundwater recharge assessment tool, which is an analytic geospatial and temporal tool that the Earth Genome and Sustainable Conservation developed, taking the site suitability factors as well as the crop calendar to rank all the fields in the Merced Irrigation District. Take the wafer schedule that Lee discussed and run that through the actual canal capacities where we've mapped where there are restrictions in the canal from Merced Irrigation District data, and then apply that to the fields that are most suitably ranked first, and then keep going down the list of ranking until we run out of water. The quantity of water that then is applied across that spatial distribution is then aggregated into monthly recharge by field and is fed into the groundwater tool, which you'll hear more about after my talk. We also compute the amount of unused water. In other words, if there weren't fields available at the right time, any water that was not used from the wafer is then calculated and returns back to the climate and flood models so that we know how much was diverted and how much remained in the flow. So what we see from that result is that recharge significantly occurs in the canals. Nearly 47% under the current climate scenario returns is recharged through the canals. In the case of Merced, they have very few recharge basins, so very limited amount, and on-farm accounts for the other half. If all of those fields that were most highly ranked were in fact accessible and available through incentives and farmer participation. How does this compare when we look at future climate? So under the current climate, what I just showed you was average wafer coming from the information from Lee of about 46,000 acre feet average annual, or 460 or million acre feet in the 100-year period. We captured all but 8%. So this goes back to our poll question. If we want to bring that back up, Tommy, if you can, taking a look at where folks were on the results. The good news is for most of you that only very few of you thought that we could capture 75 to 100%. And in fact, using existing canals and available farmland, we can capture 92% under the current climate scenario. When we increase to a future climate that's wetter and warmer and increase almost doubling the acre feet available, our total capture percentage is slightly less, but really still significantly high, suggesting that we have a lot of potential on farmland in the Merced Irrigation District to capture water if we can get the incentives right. Thank you. Yeah. So can additional unused wafer, that 8% or that 11%, be captured for recharge to reduce flood risk? And one of the things we looked at in the third piece of the study, which we're not presenting results on today, is this idea of expanding stream and river floodplain capacity to achieve not just groundwater recharge for its own sake, but to enhance ecological benefit along our riparian systems. And then more structural or gray infrastructure type solutions would be expanding the canal capacity where there's bottlenecks and increasing the field turnout capacity so that really well-drained soils on suitable sites could actually take more water than they currently can. So where you recharge, where you do the recharge is another important factor to play out here. And in the initial runs that I just showed you the results from, the default objective was simply selecting fields to maximize recharge anywhere in the district. And this figure shows the percentage or the acre feet per acre achieved on different fields in the district. What's really interesting to see, this is average acre feet per acre over 100 years, is that some of these fields are actually recharging as much water as they use in an average year, as much as 3 acre feet per acre. So some sites can capture water to fully replenish their groundwater use. Others are much less. So the recharge intensity per acre is one way to look at that. But we also started to ask ourselves the question of, what if your goal was not strictly recharge anywhere in the basin, but for instance, you wanted to do recharge retention in the basin so it doesn't flow out to adjacent sub-basins? Or what if you wanted to do recharge to provide drinking water supply for disadvantaged communities or avoid subsidence in subsidence-prone areas, or if you wanted to focus recharge for ecosystem benefits, such as groundwater-dependent ecosystems in our low-lying riparian corridors, or for wildlife habitat. So we took some of these different reservoir operation scenarios and paired them with targeting management emphasis. So for instance, in the ecosystem goal, holding a little more water back in the flood pool of the reservoirs that could be released strategically for migratory bird habitat in the spring might be, or in the fall might be another way to enhance ecosystem benefit using FERO, or releasing water from the reservoir earlier in the season in November and moving that down to enhance recharge retention in the basin for overall groundwater supply. So taking those objectives then, this is what changes in our field selection for where we would target water for in-basin retention of recharge benefits. And that shows in the dark blue here is the field, or the fields where we should really prioritize water recharge rather than in these other regions of the district, if we want to keep it in the district and not flow out to adjacent areas or back to streams. And what that looks like then in recharge results is without recharge, this is the figure I showed you a minute ago, showing the, this time it's talking about the 100-year total. And when I advance, take a look at where the dark blues shift when we focus recharge to benefit in basin retention. I'll just go back and forth and you can see how we shift from the northern portion of the district to the central portion. And the net effect is that the fields on the north now have less water applied and more water is targeted to the fields in the retention area. And this is a tool that a district could use to prioritize GSA results if that was what they wanted to prioritize. Similarly, we could take a look at community drinking water availability and focus the recharge immediately surrounding the disadvantaged communities and wells that are at risk of going dry. And then finally, a third approach would be targeting recharge to benefit both shorebird habitat in suitable locations using reservoir releases and doing recharge closer to where groundwater dependent ecosystems are located to enhance the survivability and water access for those trees. So targeted recharge really involves some trade-offs. As you saw, different portions of the district might need to be targeted for one benefit versus another. Some of them overlap. And so these kinds of decisions, as we've been hearing throughout this forum, are going to require greater collaboration and discussion amongst members of the GSAs. But we now have tools and strategies to be able to look at where those targeted efforts might go. And I'm going to turn it back to David, and you're going to hear later from Liz, who's going to talk about where that water actually went.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. Yeah, so next we're going to move on to Liz DeBramo from Woodern Curran. And yeah, she's going to present on the fate of that recharge and the subsequent groundwater supply effects and benefits. So I think Tommy will transfer to Liz, and I think we'll have another poll question, I believe.
Liz, you should have control. Just go ahead and click it and I'll get the poll ready.
Oh, you are on mute, Liz.
Hold on just a second, Liz. It looks like you popped out. I'm going to make you co-host. So now you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Great. Sorry about that. I hope everybody is, still doing okay after an hour of lots of content, lots of interesting information. Probably a good time for a stretch break. I know we'll have a longer one right after this talk. But I'm going to talk about the groundwater benefits. And, we have another little knowledge quiz for everybody to see where you think we're at. This time, the question is, on average, what rough percentage of recharged water remains in the Merced subbasin within the 100-year simulation period? And again, this is, under current conditions. So, initial groundwater levels starting about where we are today, assuming existing conditions last for 100 years. Sigma is not quite a thing in our baseline scenarios. So I'll go with the trend of the others, and we'll pull this up once the answer is revealed. So hang tight, pay attention, and we can see what the answers are.
And Liz, just to reconfirm, would you like me to leave the poll open?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
folks, just move it over to the side once you're finished. Go ahead, Liz.
Great. So David gave us a great overview. Lee talked about water available for recharge. And then Daniel talked about where we can put that water, in the canals, on agricultural fields. But now I'm going to talk about once that water is recharged, what happens to that water? What's the fate of recharge? And what are some benefits that we see to the aquifer, to the groundwater system, and also related benefits? So before we get into benefits of floodmar, though, we need to start with a baseline. So what this graph is showing is an annual groundwater budget. So on the blue bar charts on the top, those are all the inflows into the groundwater system. So you have your net deep percolation, maybe some canal seepage or some seepage from the stream, maybe flows from neighboring subbasins. And then on the bottom part of the axis, negative in gray, is all of your outflows from the groundwater system, mostly pumping or groundwater extraction. And this can change year to year. You can see in 1977, for example, it was a pretty dry year then. So we have a lot less inflows, a lot less surface water. So that means farmers had to pump more water to meet their irrigation needs. So in that year, we see a lot more outflows than inflows. And inflows minus outflows is the change in groundwater storage. And that is shown in that gray line there. So that's the cumulative change in groundwater storage. And it shows that over time, we have more outflows than we do inflows into the groundwater system in the Merced subbasin. And, we've seen this trend before, like we're trying to get roughly to about that 0 point, that's roughly groundwater sustainability. And so if we, there's a whole range of floodmar options we can consider. So many options, we have to put this table on to explain that there's a bunch of different ways. But what I want to talk about right now is just the simplest option, which is recharging just the canal system in the wintertime. It's kind of a built-in dedicated recharge basin, more or less. So if we just fill the canals in the wintertime, don't put any water on agricultural fields yet, we can add additional inflow into the groundwater system. And that's what those pink bars are up top, is this additional seepage from the canal system. So over time, that adds up, and we see that it mitigates against some groundwater overdraft by over 500,000 acre-feet by the end of the simulation period. And I forgot to mention earlier, over 100 years, we're losing about 5 million acre-feet in groundwater storage. But what if we don't just do the canal system? What if we also open it up to agricultural fields, dedicated recharge basins, and reoperate our reservoirs in order to capture, to get more of this wafer or water available for recharge? We're able to capture and recharge a lot more of that water that flows into the groundwater system. And those are those yellow bars, which really starts to mitigate this groundwater overdraft by almost half, a lot more than half. It's cut in half, this groundwater overdraft, and brings us a lot closer to sustainability. So good news is, we recharge this water, it increases the groundwater storage, and then subsequently storage increases, groundwater levels increase as well. So this map right here is showing an animation of the difference in groundwater levels between the flood scenario and the baseline scenario. And so in some places over time, and we see that groundwater levels can increase by over 70 feet. And what we're also seeing on this map is in purple, the boundaries of disadvantaged communities, or DACs. And where the groundwater levels are increasing is also where a lot of DAC locations are. And this was objective number 2 that Daniel talked about in the previous presentation. And a lot of these DACs have shallow groundwater wells for drinking water supply. So it is helpful to raise groundwater levels in these areas. We can look at what these groundwater levels look like over time. This is a groundwater hydrograph at a location just on the eastern side of the city of Merced for the baseline scenario. We can see it goes down over time. Looking at the same flood scenario that we talked about earlier, all of those bar charts are water that were monthly recharge for that scenario. And we can see that the groundwater levels, the flood scenario in green, shoot up and the groundwater levels increase and are pretty responsive to the flood And what's really interesting is that in these dry periods, in the 20s, it's dry, there's not much water that we're recharging, but still the groundwater levels remain higher than they do in the baseline. We see that in the late 80s as well and throughout the simulation period. To add on an extra layer, there's different types of reservoir reoperations like we talked about before. In simplistic terms, this recharge pool on the right is a little more aggressive. It gives us a little bit more water. But then if we look at the FURO option, we have slightly less water available for replenishment, but the management emphasis is on disadvantaged communities. So we're placing this water and recharging it where it will benefit disadvantaged communities. And even with less water than we have in the other scenario, but placing it near the DACs, we can see that groundwater levels in orange are even higher. It's kind of what you can do more with less in this situation, and allows decision makers to really think about the best use of their floodmar water and other types of benefits. And we're looking not just at DACs, but also groundwater dependent ecosystems, subsidence prone areas, groundwater dependent areas, etc. And so this is pretty exciting and interesting to see what we can do. But, once we recharge this water, we increase the groundwater storage, increase the groundwater levels. And we also see that it impacts the stream system as well. Here is a rough stream budget. Just go over this really quick to touch on the basics. Stream flows are impacted, what comes out of the reservoir, what's diverted off of the river, return flow and runoff from applied water and precipitation back into the stream. And what I'm very interested in is this stream gain and loss. So how much of the water flows between the stream and the aquifer system. So if groundwater levels are lower, the stream loses water to the aquifer system. But if they're high enough, then it can seep water or contribute water back into the stream flow. What we're looking at in these graphs is the normalized monthly average stream flow for a floodmar and baseline scenario for all water year types on the left and for critical water year types on the right. Without diving into too much detail, we see lower stream flows in the winter months because we're diverting some water off the river to recharge. But in the spring months and some fall months, we actually see higher flows, partially due to more base flow from the groundwater system. So groundwater levels are higher overall on average and contribute more to the stream. And we really see a larger difference in critical water year types where, we aren't really diverting that much. There's not much water available for recharge off of the Merced River, but groundwater levels overall are higher and can contribute more base flow. So another benefit of floodmar. Oops. Oh, I guess the numbers aren't showing up here, but I can give them away. Let's, Tommy, if you don't mind, show the results of the poll.
Yep, stand by.
Okay, it looks like about half of you said 1/3, and you are correct. It's about 1/3 of the water that's recharged stays in the Merced subbasin. We see about 20% affects, stream aquifer interactions or goes back to the stream. And we also see about 45% affects subsurface flows. Merced is not just a bathtub that doesn't interact on either side. How much of that water stays in the basin is really dependent upon how sustainable the neighbors are. And while you're thinking, man, like only 1/3 stays in the basin, from an optimist perspective, it's all going into the ground. We all kind of need to reach sustainability together. And a huge theme of this forum has also been collaboration. So maybe the ideal place to recharge, you could, make a deal with your neighbor and think of outside the box of how, again, to reach sustainability, even if it means reaching across these boundaries. But what's really interesting is that this pie chart and this distribution changes a lot depending on how much water you put on fields, where within the subbasin you put that water, and also, again, how sustainable your neighbors are. And we have a whole host of different scenarios that we're slicing and dicing this pie chart in different ways. To summarize, some of the key messages are recharge helps build groundwater resilience, and MAR helps build groundwater resilience, and intentional recharge can help achieve different management objectives and benefits. I think I'm going to turn it back now. It's time for a break and a Menti question. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to see if you have any questions either in the chat now or at our conversation at 4:15 today.
Liz, yep, you're right. It is break time. We can take a quick stretch. We are going to put a poll question up, a Menti poll question. So please try to take a minute to answer that. And we're the next 3 presentations after the break are really going to relate to that Menti question. So I'll just go ahead and read it out here real quick. What is the potential net effect of floodmar on the following water management sectors? Is it negative, neutral, positive? And they were the flood management sector, surface water management, groundwater management, and ecosystem management. So please go ahead and take the poll while we take a break, and then we'll get back to that in I think about 5-10 minutes.
And I'm gonna make sure to present it. So it should be working now. And I'm gonna pull it over. There we go. David, just to confirm, you can see it. See my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, folks, so I'll put the clock up here. I'm gonna not put the break time slide up so we can kind of see the results as they're coming in. And if you give me a second, I'll put some background music up for everyone. So David, just to reconfirm, timing wise, 5 minutes or 10 minutes? If you
5 minutes,
just 5 minutes. Yes,
yeah,
sir. Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. And can you see the clock on there as well?
I can.
Okay. Great. Let's take it down to 5 minutes. There we go. All right. And I'll play a little music in the background. And if I hear anybody coming on talk, I will turn the music down.
Thanks, Tommy.
You're very welcome. All right, David, I'll bring the presentation back up. So folks, we'll leave the Menti poll up if you like. It's in the link, and then here's the live results too while we're going through the next sections of our presentation. And David, just to confirm, Paul is up next, correct?
Yes, Paul's up next.
Okay.
Oh no, I'm up next. Sorry, it's me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yep. So let me give you remote control.
So we do that. So far, the Menti results look good. Everybody's very positive. That's great.
Okay, you should have control. It's waiting for you to take control, and then once you click your mouse, yep, you should have it now.
There we go. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Tony. Okay, we'll go ahead and get into the next part. Flood risk benefits. So yeah, that Menti question, we're asking, what are the effects? Neutral, positive, negative. A lot of positive responses, which is great. So we'll get into some of the results now and try to answer that question. And okay, here we go. So just up front, some key messages on the flood benefits of flood MAR. First, climate change will likely increase flood risk. I think we all pretty much know that. We've seen a lot of studies that have done that, CVFPP, and we'll also show some results here that back that up. Flood MAR can help reduce flood risk. Some of our flood MAR scenarios do that. And the third key message that we're really going to focus on is flood MAR with reservoir reoperations could provide the most flood risk reduction benefits. So I'm giving away a couple of the answers here, but let's go ahead and go through. So we're going to look at 3 scenarios in this presentation. The canal plus on-farm from the recharge using excesses flows version, and then 2 of our re-op scenarios. We talked about this a little bit ago. We've got a FERO scenario and a recharge pool scenario, and we'll go into a little more details what those are in a minute. But first, the climate vulnerability of the Merced watershed. We've got 100 years of hydrology. It's great. We can go through and just slice out, specific flood events or years or anything to really see how the system is performing from one year to the next. So I picked out 2 events out of that 100 years, the 1916 simulated event, and then after this, a 1956 simulated event. They are kind of bookend flood events in the system. So in the top graph here, we've got the storage hydrograph of Lake McClure. The black line is the rule curve behind it. So we've got the flood space up here. As we head into the summer months, that rule curve comes back up so we can maximize our water supply. On the bottom graph is outflow, or is flow of the Merced River at Crocker-Hoffman Dam. It's kind of the last control point, and where the main canal diversion is also at before the flows go down the Merced River. So in the baseline event, 1916 event, we have a flood event here. We encroached in the flood space. We had a peak flow of about 6,000 CFS, which is about the channel capacity of Merced. A flood event, but nothing too serious. With climate change, though, now with climate change, much more inflow. We encroach pretty much all the way to the top of the reservoir, and now we have a bigger flood event. The peak isn't that high, but it is beyond channel capacity. We've gone to 9,500 CFS. So we're most likely looking at some flood damages along the Merced River, and that flow is going to also move down into the San Joaquin, which could also contribute to some flood damages on the San Joaquin River. And the event is also longer. As a more inflow, we stayed in the flood space for longer, so we had an even longer event as well. This is another aspect that is a little harder to measure, but when those flood flows are on the levees for a really long time, that's more time for them to start to erode and seep. So not only is the peak bad, but the time is also bad as well. But one other aspect, we've got this flood, climate change vulnerability here to flood, but also to the water supply. As we get into the late spring and early summer, we had a ton of water, the reservoir's full, but now the inflows dropped off. This is that timing, a shift in timing of inflows from the kind of the spring into more the winter or early spring. So less inflow coming in, more demand, warmer temperatures. So we're getting more demand for the crops, and we actually end up having less water supply heading into the summer and to the next year. So flood vulnerability and potentially water supply vulnerability. So now we'll look at our 1956 event. This is typically the largest flood event that we have in our 100 years for all the climate scenarios. So this is the biggest one, and we'll look at this. So again, we encroach in the reservoir, but the reservoir is able to handle it, and we put out 6,000 CFS for this flood event in our baseline current climate condition, no problems, or not much. Now with our future climate change, that peak flow is almost 6 times what it was in the current climate. We've got a peak outflow of 35,000 CFS. That is huge. That is a huge flow for the Merced River. That's huge damages, and that's going to perpetuate down into the San Joaquin River and system as well. And it's a longer event as well. And again, even though we have all this inflow, the reservoir staying up higher throughout most of the spring, eventually less inflow, more demands, again, less carryover storage heading into the next year, potential water supply effect as well there. So what can FloodMar do for this? So first we'll go back. Now we're looking at the flow hydrographs on the Merced River for the 1916 event up here and the 1956 event here. And we'll look at that recharge only scenario using the on-farm and canal, no reservoir re-ops. And the scenario is basically just skimming water off of that hydrograph. So you can see here our baseline peak flow is about 6,000 for both these events. With FloodMar, we're skimming about 1,900 off. That's about the capacity of the canal system off the Merced. Taking that off the top of the hydrograph, moving it for recharge, and getting some flood benefit out of that. But what about with climate change? What about if we're just skimming off of that? With our 1916 event, that 9,500 CFS peak drops to 7,600. Some flood damage reduction, some flood benefit, but we still got a peak flow that's greater than the channel capacity of the Merced River. And it hasn't really done anything about the timing of that. It's just skimming off the top. Now for the 1956 event, here again, we're just skimming off the top. 35, 33, still a huge amount of damage. That kind of first version of FloodMar isn't really doing much anymore when we start to look at climate change flows. It can't do a lot when it's just skimming off the top of those hydrographs. So what can we do about that? That's where we go into our reservoir reoperation scenarios now. So we're going to go into 2 of them. First, our FERO scenario. One of the first things is we increase the flood release capacity. In all those other scenarios, it typically goes up to 6 before it goes into kind of emergency operation and then starts to dump like the 35,000 it did in the 56 scenario. But if we can release a little bit more before we get into those emergency operations, we can release the capacity of the river plus the capacity of the canal system, another 1,900. Now we can release 7,900 CFS approximately out of the reservoir. Our FERO looks at a 5-day forecast. So we look five days ahead to see what that inflow is going to look like. We have that 50,000 acre-foot buffer above the rule curve. So we try to stay within that buffer as we can and meter out flows to try to maximize recharge. And in our FERO scenario, we've also incorporated a lot of ecosystem operations. We call them eco pool operations. We create this eco pool account, whereas we are in the FERO zone, as we get to the tail end of the FloodMar season, of the flood season, any water that we've been able to bank up there, we can then use later for things like shorebird releases. We use that water, we make releases, divert it through the canal system onto ag lands for shorebird habitat. We use some of that water to do a spring pulse flow in the month of April. And outside of the eco account, we also increase the minimum flow releases of the reservoir during the winter period as well. One other aspect about the FERO operation is if we see a large enough event, even if we're below that 50,000 acre foot buffer zone, we'll start to do these kind of quicker releases so that we don't go all the way up to the top of the dam if we can help it. So now we'll just focus on the 56 event. This is the big one, and we're just going to focus on climate change. For current climate, we were okay. So here again, you know, the reservoir basically filled up. It came in under the rule curve. We had a huge inflow event, got to the top of the dam, and we had this huge peak outflow of 35,000 CFS. So with FERO, we start to release sooner. That 5-day forecast shows that that inflow is going to push us up near the top of the reservoir. Let's release a couple days sooner. And we're releasing now at a higher flow rate. Here it's around 8,000 CFS. We're releasing a couple days sooner and releasing more flow. Eventually, it does get about to the top of the reservoir, and we still have to make a little extra flood release. The reservoir outflow is about 10,500, but FloodMar is pulling off 1,900 of that. So the peak flow down the Merced River has now been reduced from what was a 35,000 CFS event to about 8,700 CFS. Still probably some flood damages, but a huge reduction. in flood risk. And this purple area here is all floodmar diversions that are happening and recharge. So we've decreased our flood risk, and we've done a lot of floodmar recharge. And we're able to keep a little bit here. The green is the FURO storage. As we're heading into the month of May, we stayed in that 50,000 acre foot buffer zone, and we were able to keep that water and use it as an eco account. Sorry, let's turn off on me. And with that, we were able to do shorebird habitat releases and also the spring out migration pulse release in the month of April. And you can see eventually we get back to about where baseline was. So we've reoperated the reservoir. We eventually get back to about the baseline condition as far as storage in the reservoir, but we completely reshaped the outflow hydrograph and managed to do some recharge too. So what about the recharge pulse scenario? So again, this one increases the release capacity to about 7,900. Now we're kind of doing a flip here. We are drawing down the reservoir at the beginning of the season to 100,000 acre feet below that top of conservation pool rule curve line. And we release it at a rate that can be captured by the main canal, that 1900 CFS. We meter that flow out and it all goes to recharge. And as we do that drawdown. And I think Lee alluded to this, we try to track those deficits created by the releases. And as we try to refill when the system is in excess conditions to not harm downstream users. So those operations are built into there. So what kind of results do we get out of this one? So we'll look again at the 1956 simulated event. And now we came in, we did a drawdown the previous year, and we came in much lower in storage. And since we were much lower in storage, we had a lot more flood space now, and we were able to contain that inflow where we didn't even get to the top of the reservoir this time. We contained that inflow, and we released it at about 7,900 CFS to make sure we didn't go to the top of the reservoir. And 1,900 of that is still diverted, around 1,900 of that is still diverted for floodmar. We get our peak flow down to about 6,500 CFS. There's a few times here where we have a little bit of unused wafer that stays back in the system. But essentially, we brought that peak flood from 35,000 down to 6,500 by doing a drawdown in a previous year that ended up carrying through into this year. So overall, floodmar adaptation potential, how does it help with flood risk? So we have two metrics here that we're using. We're looking at total number of days when our flow is above 7,300 CFS. So I said channel capacity is about 6,000. Through our modeling and working with Merced Irrigation District, we've kind of determined that there was like kind of an inflection point when it comes to damages at about 7,300. Between 6,000 and 73, damages are fairly minor. Above 73, damages really start to take off. So we've used that as kind of our measuring stick here. And then we look at peak flow magnitude for the 1956 event. How do we affect that? So in baseline, we always just had a peak flow of 6,000. We never went above that 7,300 baseline current condition, current climate, we were okay. But future climate now, we had that huge peak outflow, 35,000 CFS, and we have 44 days out of that 100 years where we're above the 7,300 CFS. So lots of potential flood damages. Our recharge only scenario is able to help a little bit with that. We could reduce that number of days above that 7,300 from 44 to 28. So less often are we, having these flood damages. But those big peak events like the 56 event isn't really helping with that. We go from 35 to 33, not much of a difference. With reservoir reoperation now added in, we've decreased the number of days from 44 to 11 with the FURO alternative, and that peak flow down to 8,700. And with the recharge pool, we've been able to reduce it from 44 down to just 6 days, and that 56 event is down to 6,500. There's a few days and some other events that don't quite get reduced all the way. But essentially, we've been able to reduce our flood risk for this future climate scenario greatly. So I will go ahead and do there. So now I'm going to hand it over to Paul Bergman from ESA to go over the ecosystem benefits and effects. And Tommy, I think you'll be handing him control.
Yep, give me just a sec. I'm going to make it so Paul is highlighted here. There you go. Now I can see you, Paul. Let me give you remote control.
Okay.
And then Paul, you should, if you move your mouse around or click, should engage. There it goes. And then click a couple times and it should advance it.
Okay.
There it
There we
goes.
go. All right. All right, great. Yeah, so just want to start off with a little introduction here. I think it's been well described, you know, the benefits of flood-mar to things like flood risk and water supply. I think that's pretty clear. And benefits to sort of non-aquatic species like trees, shorebirds that rely on things like groundwater and surface water that are affected by these recharge actions. Also, I think we expect to see benefits there. Today, we're not going to talk about shorebird results, just due to time constraints, but we will talk about groundwater dependent ecosystems. So we'll have some results for impacts to trees. But I think, you know, one big thing is with aquatic species that rely on in-stream flow, I think, you know, it's not as obvious, right? There's definitely some potential for impacts there and also potential for benefits. We'll talk about both of those. So I think it's seen in other studies that have done flood-mar, aquifer recharge is expected to, you know, increase groundwater discharge to the stream. So when you're removing water during flood flows, putting it on the floodplain, this could increase groundwater discharge in the springtime. And this could be really beneficial for things like salmonids that could be rearing in the river during this time, especially in a river like the Merced, where you're at the southernmost point of where these fish exist. So it's already at a pretty tenuous position, and now add climate change to the mix, temperature is pretty important. So this is a potential benefit of flood-mar that, unfortunately, we didn't have temperature modeling for the Merced River, so I'm not going to be able to show results for that, but just keep that in mind. It's another added benefit of flood-mar to these species. But impacts to aquatic species due to, you know, flood flow reductions, we think, you know, can be minimized or benefits created through the following actions. Things like managing reservoir reoperations to maximize key life stages like spawning, that we'll talk about, creating these targeted pulse flows that trigger key environmental processes, and then lastly, pairing flood-mar operations with habitat restoration could also be beneficial. So some of the objectives of our work here was to evaluate the potential effects of flood-mar on GDEs, or groundwater dependent ecosystems, and salmonids, and provide recommendations for reservoir reoperations and infrastructure enhancements like restoration to help minimize impacts and provide these potential benefits for these species. A little background environmental setting for the Merced River. For those of you not well or familiar with the river, it's, you know, pretty impacted, right? Water supply infrastructure really regulates the flow and temperature in this river. It's disconnected from its natural cycles, basically. And a lot of dredging and mining historically have really altered the habitat. So you have reduced sediment load, a lot of deep pools from a lot of that tailwater habitat. That's not really good for salmonids. A lot of the floodplains have been covered, and the channel has been confined. And a lot of these bank stabilization efforts have really limited channel migration and have hindered a lot of the native riparian vegetation that would be beneficial for these species. But there are a lot of ongoing restoration efforts both in the channel and in the floodplain. So one of the focal species groups, as I mentioned, were GDEs. So these are plant and animal communities that require groundwater for some or all their water needs. And GDEs really provide a lot of environmental benefits and other benefits like, you know, water purification, flood mitigation, base flow in rivers, and various recreational opportunities as well. And we're going to evaluate the effects of flood-mar relative to some of the rooting depths of some of these really key tree species. And on the right here, you can see the location of all the groundwater nodes that were analyzed. And the different colors represent 5 different reaches. So we have 2 reaches in the Merced and then 3 reaches in the San Joaquin Basin. In addition to GDEs, we'll be talking a lot about impacts to fish, and we're focusing on steelhead and Chinook salmon. So both these species require fresh water for spawning and rearing. That's why the Merced River is so important for these fish. They're dependent on adequate depth, velocity, substrates, and cool temperatures. And the life stages we're going to focus on today are spawning, floodplain rearing, and the juvenile immigration life stage. And I wanted to just show you, walk through some of these three metrics for evaluating impacts to salmonids. One here is looking at spawning and rearing habitat. We're only going to show the spawning results today just because of time constraints. But we looked at the impacts of these habitats in these three reference reaches. And the metric that we're using is weighted usable area. I also don't have time to describe what that means, but basically it's an index. For those who don't know, it's an index of the amount of suitable habitat for this particular life stage. So habitat that's meeting depth and velocity requirements for spawning, for example. These relationships have been created previously through previous work, so we're just applying them here. And so this amount of area available for spawning varies based on flow. So we can use that to evaluate the impacts of flood mar. So another indicator is in-stream flow for juvenile emigrants. As juvenile fish move downstream, the more flow that's in the river, generally the better survival. These fish generally move faster. They're exposed to predators for a less length of time, so their survival increases. So we're looking at this at a monthly basis. That's the resolution of the flow model. Oh, and we looked at that in these lower reaches, these lower two reaches. And the third indicator would be potential floodplain habitat. As I said before, I think the river is really channelized. There's not a lot of this floodplain habitat really available for these fish, but we still want to include it as a variable. As restoration occurs, this habitat hopefully would become more and more available. So it's something that we want to at least track and to look at sort of the impact of the different flow scenarios on this amount of this habitat available. So you've seen this table before, just kind of showing you the scenarios we're going to present on today. So we're just going to focus on the current climate results today, just because of time constraints. And sort of three major scenarios we'll present on: the recharge only, recharge with reservoir reoperations, and then the third one is reservoir reoperations and infrastructure improvements that include restoration. So as was mentioned previously, and you'll see it in the results, flood mar actions were occurring in November through March. And in these FERO scenarios, flows are really set to maximize spawning habitat. So we'll show those results. And also in the wintertime, flood storage is being built up in the winter to kind of create some eco releases, spring pulse flows, floodplain inundation flows in the springtime. So you'll see that as well. We modeled 100 years with simulated. So when you see the results of the box and whisker plots, that variability is a result of 100 years that were run. And as I mentioned, the kind of third scenario, infrastructure changes included some simulated floodplain restoration. So you'll see that in those results of the third scenario. And just as we've been mentioning, all results are preliminary and I think subject to change. Some of these are hot off the press, like this third scenario. So just diving right into some results. This is for GDEs. So on the y-axis is groundwater depth, going from 0 feet at the top to 80 feet at the bottom. And the x-axis is reach. So you have the 2 Merced reaches and then the 3 San Joaquin reaches. And you have rooting depth of some key species. So box elder is that solid gray line, and then the dash gray is the rooting depth of valley oak. And then on all these slides, you'll see this color, these colors show up. The green is baseline, orange is recharge only, and purple is recharge with reservoir reoperation. So you can see the impact of flood mar. You see this subtle decrease in groundwater depth. So that would be considered a benefit for these species. You're getting closer towards their rooting depth, providing this benefit for them. Particularly if you look at, say, the box elder, that solid gray line, you can see in these San Joaquin reaches, because of the project in this scenario, you're getting closer to that rooting depth of that particular species. So overall, a relatively small, but a benefit to GDEs of the project. So moving on to spawning, this is for Chinook salmon. So on the y-axis is spawning habitat in acre days, and on the x is months, September through January. And you can see that, once again, the flood mar recharge actions are occurring November through March. So we have that highlighted here. You'll see that in other slides. So really negligible impact here between baseline and recharge on spawning habitat. You're not seeing a big shift here of the project on spawning. But one thing that can be done is what we did is we provided some recommendations for reservoir operations to target the spawning life stage. And so we're targeting these flows of in October to December of 140 to 400 CFS, and January to February of 160 to 800. So this is the timing of spawning for Chinook salmon and steelhead. And so these are the flows from that previous habitat suitability exercise that has been done. These are the flows that maximize the amount of suitable spawning habitat that's available. So, and these are relatively low flows, and that's sort of indicative of the fact that the system is relatively, been channelized. The river is very incised, so it's very deep and narrow. And so if you had a bunch of higher flows would be too deep or be moving too fast to really be suitable for spawning. So actually it's the lower flows that actually have really maximize the spawning area because you get the right depths and velocities for spawning to occur. So with this recommendation, then you see it show up in the results. The purple is with these reservoir reoperations. So November through January for Chinook salmon, you see a pretty big bump in the overall spawning habitat during these months because we're targeting these flows that are maximizing the amount of suitable habitat for spawning. So that is the results for spawning. And then the next would be juvenile emigration. So as I said before, this is indexed by monthly flow on the y-axis and then month December through May on the x. Similar to spawning, you're seeing a really negligible change in monthly flows. You're not seeing a big shift here between the baseline and the recharge. But just like with spawning, what you can do is provide some recommendations to encourage emigration in the springtime. So this is through a spring pulse flow event. And so this is done in a lot of systems, where historically you would have had a lot of these big winter or spring storms that would encourage fish to move downstream towards the ocean. These are often built into reservoir operations. We actually modeled this, I think, after the Sacramento River system has something similar. So in this case, you're a pulse flow of 1200 CFS. That's an overbanking flow in the river. It's being recommended for 3 days, and then this is followed by a linear reduction back down to base flows over the course of 11 days. And it's shaped like that because it's been shown that some fish respond to that initial pulse of 3 days while downstream, and others are responding to that receding limb of the hydrograph and are moving downstream once the flows are slowly reducing. So we've added that into this reservoir reoperation scenario, and it's pretty subtle, but you see it pop up here in this purple bar. You see this slight uptick here in monthly flow in April. This is a monthly measurement, member. That's why I think it's relatively subtle there, but we do believe that that's the benefit to help move fish along during the springtime. Another thing you see in the results here is less variability in the winter months, December through March, compared to recharge only and baseline. And that's because we're heavily sort of managing the operations of the reservoir for a lot of different competing resource areas. So that heavy management is resulting in that less variability in your monthly flows. So that's juvenile emigration. And then the last one is potential floodplain habitat. This is habitat that's connected to the main channel, but is inundating when flood flows occur, creating this habitat that has these suitable depths for these fish and is connected to the main stem. So one thing, as I mentioned, we really are optimizing for spawning habitat, and spawning habitat is optimized at relatively low flows. What also is occurring is that we're storing flood flows in the wintertime. We're holding flow back to do some springtime releases for the environment. So what all that does is it's really favoring in-stream habitat over off-channel habitat. And as I said before, off-channel habitat is really limited in the Merced River, right? It's very confined. There's not a lot of connectivity. So it makes a lot of sense in the current state of the river that you would be really favoring in-stream habitat and really focusing in on that really critical life stage of spawning. So there is definitely a trade-off that we're making here, and you'll see that in the results. You'll see some reductions in floodplain habitat due to the project because of that. But we are providing a recommendation to encourage, inundation of the floodplain in our in the reservoir reoperation scenario, and that's as follows. So we're recommending an inundation event in the springtime. This occurs at sustaining a flow of 1,800 CFS. This creates habitat of adequate depth of at least a foot deep. One thing that's important is it needs to be inundated for a minimum duration. So this is a 2-week inundation time. And that's due to the fact that, in literature, it takes time for this water to be out in the floodplain to actually create, primary, secondary productivity to create food for fish that are out there in the floodplain. So you need to have it out there for at least 2 weeks. And once again, this recommendation is based on the current levee configuration. So currently it takes 1,800 CFS to to kind of engage this habitat. But if restoration occurred, if levees are set back, if excavation happened, these habitats could be inundated at lower flows. You could have a lower cost of water basically with restoration. But currently we're using current levee configuration. And another thing that we did was we conducted a simple GIS exercise to kind of look at some targeted habitat restoration actions. We don't have time to kind of go into how we did that analysis, but basically at second bullet describes it. We're kind of estimating the hydrologically connected inundated area that would be created with a minimal amount of excavation. So assuming 5 feet or less excavation in some of these reference reaches, how much habitat could we create? Floodplain habitat, additional floodplain habitat could we create? So this is what this really represented was like low-hanging fruit. We wanted to just very quickly, what's the kind of minimum amount of restoration that we could gain in these reference reaches with with this sort of low-hanging fruit type restoration activity. So this next slide kind of gives you a sense of what that exercise entailed. So on the left is the terrain for a particular reach, and on the right shows you then the habitat in tan that was created with doing these simple 5 foot or less excavations. You could see sort of the potential of the area that would be inundated and activated at 1,800 CFS with these restoration efforts. So that it shows you some side channels and some alcoves that were created under this sort of simulated restoration. So we included that in our results, and you'll see that in the next slide as well. So this slide sort of wraps up this variable potential floodplain habitat. A lot's happening here, so take our time on this slide. But on the y-axis is floodplain inundation in acre days, and then month on the x again. And you see me add this pink scenario, which is including the reservoir reoperations with infrastructure changes and these assumptions about restoration. So having this newly created habitat engaging, you could see some increases in the amount of floodplain inundation. So, I mean, it's a big take home here is in this winter period, as I mentioned, you're seeing, for one thing, right, where we're targeting spawning during this period. So spawning is really being maximized at these lower flows, right? So we're really trading off, focusing on spawning. You're seeing these kind of reductions in floodplain inundation, partly due to the focus of spawning in the stream. But also, we're holding back flood flows during this time. Floodmar is having recharge actions, and we're holding back flows to create these spring ecosystem events. And so there's a trade-off there too. That's also why you're seeing these reductions in the wintertime of floodplain habitat. So in the spring, though, you're seeing this, increase in April due to these pulse flows. And in this case, you're seeing May, you're seeing an increase in floodplain inundation due to that inundation flow I mentioned, 2-week inundation event, and also the simulated restoration. So there's more area that's being inundated with that restoration that was simulated. You're seeing this big bump here in May of floodplain habitat. So that's the variable potential floodplain habitat. And I think we're left with just some key takeaways here, some key messages. One being that floodmar actions are expected to benefit GDEs and shorebirds. As I said, we didn't get into the shorebird results, but do expect to see a benefit generally to those species. And I think it's important to note that, aquifer recharge alone, without carefully considering aquatic species, it may have some net negative impacts. If you're simply taking away flood flows and not carefully considering the life history of these species, you could have some, negative impacts to these organisms. But there's a lot that could be done to optimize for the environment. So we did some optimization here, but I think you could even think through these even more and think about different ways to optimize for things like salmonids. actions that are listed here, like the timing and frequency of pulse and floodplain flows, the trade-off between in-channel versus off-channel habitat, and then something I mentioned at the beginning, but modeling of gain to stream. So, putting more aquifer recharge, you have more groundwater going to the stream, which could be beneficial for water temperatures. So thinking about how and where you're putting that water on the floodplain could have more benefits of water coming back to the stream. And then lastly, things I mentioned, operations could minimize impacts and create benefits by fine-tuning releases to maximize spawning, providing pulse flows, and then lastly, what we just touched on, but like floodplain restoration could be really beneficial as well. So pairing these flood mar actions with restoration could create a lot of benefits for these species too. So with that, I think I hand it back to David.
Great. Yes, thank you, Paul. Great presentation. All right, we are a little behind on time, so we'll move right into Karen Dev's presentation. He's going to kind of wrap it all up now on multi-sector performance and those benefits and trade-offs, and this should get to answering the Menti poll question that we had at the beginning of this this part of the session. So Karen Dev, go ahead.
Hey, David.
You should have control now, Karen Dev.
Perfect. You waiting for the slide update. Yeah. Looks like I moved the cursor. There we are. Thank you. Welcome everyone. It's been a great presentation so far. Covered a lot of detail. So with this presentation over the next 15 minutes, my goal would be to take a high-level overview of the study results and really try to tie up the different scenarios that were being discussed in the previous presentations and use a consistent set of indicators to evaluate these different scenarios and see how they perform under the different water management sectors. David tried to highlight, with presentation so far, they have focused heavily on floodmar, which is fitting since floodmar forum is where we are. Part of the process is we can also leverage these watershed studies to understand the vulnerability to climate change. So we'll start off with looking at climate vulnerability by comparing the baseline current condition scenario with the baseline future conditions. And then we'll move over to looking at the adaptation potential provided by these floodmar scenarios. So for a given scenario, we will be evaluating the effects across the three sectors as listed on the screen: flood, water supply, and ecosystem, using the integrated headwater to groundwater modeling toolset that's capable of modeling the physical and the operational aspects of the system that we're looking at. Again, these tools are not perfect, but we believe they have the reasonable accuracy to provide meaningful results within each sector. Now, the eventual goal with these effects is to understand or to assess the potential public and private benefits that are typically associated with a floodmar project, including flood risk reduction, improved water supply reliability, aquifer replenishment, and ecosystem enhancement. Let's start with climate vulnerability. The key findings with respect to climate vulnerability are, the first one is each sector, the flood, water supply, and ecosystem, is vulnerable to climate change. The results will show that increased flood risk resulting from higher peak flows and more frequent high flow events, increased applied water demand resulting from higher temperatures, increased reliance on groundwater pumping to meet that additional demand, lower carryover storage due to higher summer demand and the shift in the runoff to earlier in the season, and then finally diminishing ecological habitat. Now, the second finding with respect to climate change is that these sector vulnerabilities are often interconnected. Due to the shift in the runoff timing to earlier in the spring season, we see higher flood peaks in winter and early spring months, which is of concern to the flood managers. A lower carryover storage because of the diminishing snowpack and higher crop demand which is of concern to the water supply managers. And this reminds of the graphic that David shared showing that 1916 event there. And then overall, the increased agriculture demand places additional burden on the groundwater resources during the peak irrigation season, which is of concern to the groundwater managers. And collectively, lower surface water and groundwater storage results in less water being available for ecosystem functions and even warmer in-stream water temperatures, which is of concern to the ecosystem managers. All this is revolving from the shift in the runoff timing, and really have to start thinking beyond our silos, beyond our individualized management sectors, to really come up with a strategy that really addresses the vulnerabilities imposed by climate change. So let's look at some select model results comparing the current and the future climate. You'll see a lot of numbers over the next few slides, but the focus is the key here is to focus on the projected relative change, which I've color coded for you. So red would mean a decline in performance, gray would mean insignificant change, and then green would mean an improvement in performance. And we're tracking the three sectors: flood, water supply, and ecosystem. The last two columns will contain the absolute values from the current and the future climate. And just a reminder, the future climate is the warmer and the wetter scenario. So we are 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature and 10% increase in precipitation. Now the results are sensitive to which climate scenario we pick. So some of these results will be different had we chosen just a warmer scenario or a warmer and drier scenario. With the wetter scenario, the flood risks are amplified and the impact to water supply are somewhat reduced. So just because you have more water in the system. So let's start with flood risk. Here we're tracking flows at Copper Hoffman. This is the location that David shared in the beginning of the presentation. It's a location of interest relatively upstream along the Merced River, just downstream of the point of diversion for Floodmar and other surface water deliveries. So as David's presentation highlighted, the current system is adequately designed to handle the flood flows. So we're not seeing much of a flood concern in the current conditions, but as climate, under future climate, we do expect the flood concerns to increase, where we expect the peak flow magnitude to increase about 6-fold, and to also start seeing some days in the system where we are exceeding that critical flood threshold. Now, in the water supply sector, despite an increase in 10% precipitation, that means overall getting more water into the system, we see that the average annual agricultural demand increases by about 30,000 acre-feet per year, and that is because of the increase in temperature. Some of this increased demand is met by surface water delivery, and the rest is met by groundwater pumping, and we can see the groundwater pumping increases by about 16,000 acre-feet in order to meet a portion of that increased agricultural demand. Now, due to the shift in the runoff timing and the overall increase in runoff in the wetter scenario, we see the system is able to refill more in the winter months. As a result, we have higher storage at the beginning of the irrigation season, which is March 1st. However, due to loss of that spring runoff and higher agricultural applied water demand, the end of October carryover storage is slightly lower than the baseline 518 versus 516, despite starting off with 50,000 acre-feet more in storage at the beginning of the irrigation season. Now, under the ecosystem management sector, we're tracking groundwater-dependent ecosystems habitat and the fish habitat in and around the Merced River. Overall, if the conditions are getting wetter, as the temperature is getting warmer, there seems to be no significant change to habitat availability. Now, but I do like to point out this analysis is focused on the in-stream flows. Inclusion of water temperature data, which we are not modeling at this time, is expected to show greater vulnerability. Overall, we see that there are some vulnerabilities in each one of those respective sectors, and as I highlighted previously, they are all interconnected with each other. So let's look at the adaptation potential for implementing these floodmarsh strategies. Now, the key findings with respect to the adaptation potential are that the scale matters. It was going to discuss earlier today by Graham Fox's presentation that recharge is local, but the recharge benefits are regional. was highlighted by Tim Quinn yesterday. They said, grow the problem. So what happens is at the watershed scale, we're able to grow the problem, which allows us to kind of consider both the challenges and the opportunities. At that scale, it gives us access to a broader portfolio of supply sources and provides greater operational and logistical flexibility that is needed to create those multi-sector partnerships, which were then highlighted by Paul in the previous presentation. Now, at the watershed scale and with right partnerships, FloodMAR can be designed to provide multi-sector resilience. And lastly, by the bigger the tent, the greater the benefits, right? So, and in the next few slides, we'll quantitatively look at how benefits grow as the collaborative partnerships expand. Let's start with the service districts. The service districts can manage excess flows to provide water supply benefits and contribute towards creating a portfolio, a solution in that portfolio towards achieving long-term groundwater sustainability. Let's look at the canal-only scenario, where we have, we're just diverting excess flows using the existing conveyance system. On average, we have about 23,000 acre-feet per year that's applied towards recharge, which then lowers the long-term groundwater overdraft rate from 42,000 acre-feet to 34,000 acre-feet. So if you recall from Liz's presentation, only about a third of the recharge water stays within the primary recharge basin. So even though we're applying about 23,000 acre-feet, we only retain about 8,000, which is about a third of that 23,000 acre-feet. Now let's grow this tent to then include both the service district and the growers, who can then collectively expand the recharge potential and begin to realize substantial water supply benefits and even some flood risk reduction benefits. So for this, let's compare with the canal plus the on-farm scenario, where we expand recharge to include agricultural land while still only managing excess flows in the system. And if you recall from Daniel's presentation, that as we expand to on-farm, we do consider the cultural practices and crop schedules when determining which fields are available for recharge. So as a result of expanding to on-farm, we're able to apply 3 times more water towards recharge, which ultimately cuts the long-term groundwater overdraft rate in half. We don't see a reduction in peak flow, but we do see a reduction in number of days above that critical flood threshold. And there's a mixed effect on the ecosystem, as kind of demonstrated in Paul's presentation. By recharging, we're able to improve accessibility for the groundwater dependent ecosystem to the groundwater levels. But there's no effect on the in-channel spawning habitat, but we do see a reduction in the potential floodplain habitat because we're kind of tapping into those high flow events. But as Paul mentioned, the current off-channel habitat lacks the necessary conditions to support fish habitat. So yes, we do see a reduction in floodplain habitat or floodplain inundation, but under existing conditions, without restoration, it may not translate to a significant decline in fish habitat. So let's further expand the tent to include reservoir operators by combining recharge with reservoir operation, that we can provide substantial water supply and flood risk reduction benefits, as David discussed in his presentation. So let's look at that recharge pool scenario under reservoir plus reoperation, under recharge plus reservoir reoperation. And what we find is, with the reservoir, with the recharge pool scenario, if you recall, that we are releasing some of that stored water from the conservation pool early in the winter months to vacate that storage so that we can capture the runoff in winter and spring months, with the hope that that space that's created early in the season is then filled up by the runoff later in the season. Now, that gamble doesn't always pay off, and I did see a comment from Richard McCann there, that there is that trade-off there. So what we do find is, as a result, over the long term, we see increased reliance on groundwater pumping and also lower carryover storage because we're not able to fill that space that's vacated in reservoir every single year. But by collectively managing the reservoir and the surface and groundwater storages, we see a significant increase in volume that's being applied towards recharge. The volume increases by about 5-fold. And also we see a substantial decline in long-term groundwater overdraft rate, despite seeing that increase in groundwater pumping. So there is that silver lining to collective, to that conjunctive management where we, each system is exposed, but collectively the watershed as a whole benefits from that effort. We see a significant decline in flood risk. The peak flood flow reduces from 35,000 CFS down to 6,500 CFS. The number of days above the threshold reduces from 44 down to just 6 days there. We also see some benefits to the ecosystem, but the overall, the potential floodplain habitat is still reduced because we are kind of capturing some of those high flow events and retaining that water behind storage to fill up that vacated storage space. So now finally, see, by expanding the intent to include the environmental and local community interests, we can begin to provide opportunities for strategic management of resources and start truly creating those multi-sector solutions. And Liz demonstrated that through her slide with the disadvantaged communities. By recharging around them, we're able to create higher groundwater levels around those communities, even with a smaller volume of water available or applied towards recharge. So let's look at the remaining 2 level 2 scenarios, the zero and the zero/recharge pool scenario. And let's look at how the results compare with respect to the others. As expected, with a diverse range of interests that lends to competing needs for water. So we do have to strike a balance between excess flows that are left in stream versus the excess flows that are managed for recharge. So overall, the applied recharge volume reduces compared to the recharge pool scenario, but relative to the baseline, if you look at it, there's still a significant reduction in flood risk, and there's a substantial improvement in the groundwater conditions. And there's still the benefits to the ecosystem are still retained, with the exception of the potential floodplain habitat. And if you recall there, Paul, in the near the end of his presentation, alluded to, if you start restoring floodplains or start designing inundation flows that can then provide, that can sustain that floodplain habitat, what happens then? So for that, we're looking under the zero scenario under the last level of implementation, recharge plus reservoir reoperation plus infrastructure improvement. And that's where you see the number as, much closer to what you find in the baseline. In the baseline scenario for the potential floodplain is around 5,600 acre days. And with this level of implementation where flows are designed to provide for floodplain inundation, we have around 5,200 acre days. And again, this requires restoration, collaboration across different interests to kind of realize these levels of benefits. You wanted to point out one last thing. The results are scenario dependent, right? So if you were to look at current climate conditions, you could see a slightly different picture where you don't have a whole lot of flood risk to manage because the system is adequately designed. The benefits to floodplains could actually exceed the baseline. So the results are scenario dependent. And that kind of alludes me to the last point. So which scenario to pick? Why are we presenting results for the 10% increase in precipitation and 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperature? Well, we don't know which scenario to pick, but we can then look across a range of climate scenarios. And that kind of brings me to my last point, that each scenario has a likelihood of occurrence associated with it, which changes based on how far in the future we're projecting. And by combining the results, we can then start to look at the risk-based assessment as opposed to the scenario-based assessment. We can begin to answer the questions like, instead of saying how much change we can expect to see, we can expect to communicate results like the likelihood of getting a certain change. Time is out, but we do have a presentation in the on-demand section that goes through the risk-based. So I do highly encourage for folks who are interested in this topic to go visit that presentation. And the title for that is Risk-Based Results. With that, I'll conclude and pass it back to David.
Thanks, Karandev. I'm glad you mentioned the on-demand content. I forgot to mention that earlier. We do have a number of presentations that we've uploaded that are the more technical get into a little from the models, some more of these results and items in the on-demand content. So we'll now move on into the last part of our presentation, part 3. So we're going to hear from Hisham Patel, the Deputy General Manager of Water Supply and Rights for Merced Irrigation District. He's going to give us MID's perspective on working on this watershed study with DWR. Hisham, I believe he's on.
Yeah, he's on. I'm ready to make him primary as soon as I see his camera come up.
I don't think he has a camera.
Ah, okay. I
There he
will.
is. He does. I see him.
Oh, he does. Okay.
All right.
There we
All right.
go. We
We
can
don't have
see
a
you.
camera, huh? Yeah.
We can all see you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good. Okay. First of all, thank you all. It has been quite an interesting journey for us, and to see all the consultants and all the professionals who worked on this, starting from the summit and the crest of the Sierras, going all the way down to the groundwater table, is quite a feast. We didn't think that we're going to go this far when we started working with DWR. What was that, 5 years ago, Dave, something like that. And it has really expanded. The interesting piece of this study is the fact that not only we're talking about direct diversion of floodwater, but also in the case of Merced Irrigation District, also combining reservoir reoperation. So depending on where the interest is in the state, you could see with this one example how you could look for the optimal usage of floodwater for multiple benefits. So so that's pretty interesting. But depending on where you happen to be in the state and what are your circumstances, at least you could see the breadth of a flood MAR study and what would that involve. Now, as far as the local impact, it's the idea that that flood MAR is doable in our area, not only because of Merced River and the reservoir we have on Merced River, but also the streams that we happen to have in the basin. So that would add another dimension to this study for those who are interested in looking at flood MAR. You have a major trib to the San Joaquin River in our case, plus we have the small streams, plus we have a reservoir on a major river. So you could, depending where you happen to be in the state, you could pick and choose, and you could look on how you combine these aspects of the study. The other thing is these studies are conceptual. So as you know, we're looking into the crystal ball for the future. We don't know how climate change is going to look like, except that it doesn't look like it's going to be going in the positive direction. So no matter how you look at it, dry or wet, either way, we're talking about a challenge in the future. So it's worthwhile to kind of start wading into that concept. As you know, depending on what you're doing with the state and the Fed, sometimes they require climate change and sometimes they don't. Well, how about we always look at it and see what is the impact, regardless of what the state is asking us to do or not. The other thing is that we understand that this study is not cast in stone. The numbers are not cast in stone. We're making assumptions on how the climate change is going to happen, how the degrees of the increase in temperatures. We're also making assumptions on how would the soils accept the recharge. And we're also making assumptions on how the water will make it all the way down to the reservoir and the residency of that recharged water. So there's a lot of assumptions in there. And in the case of the ecosystem, it goes not only assumptions, but also opinions. As you know, the biological opinions, there's all kinds of opinions. But to transcend all of these issues, I think if you look at the overall study, that you could see that this is the last frontier for water supply, and the last frontier for an additional benefit from the existing resources. Most of the rivers have already been appropriated, and there's water rights, which are paper water rights that basically exceeds the water supply in a normal year, but not in a wet year. So the only water that is available to look at is this flood water, and we're talking about flood water, not water that is running down the stream. We're talking about a higher amount of water that is above and beyond all of the needs in the watershed. So, and now where we get beyond the study, this is that's when we get to the regulatory issues and how. So everything we've done, everything we looked at, it looks like it's doable. Yes, we could do it. But in fact, you have to go through the regulatory processes. So when you look at the FIRO, and when you look at the last options where we could draw down the reservoir, all of these have water right implications on the reservoir, on how we manage our reservoirs and how those work with all the licenses. To take water out of the streams has also its own challenges of what's happening in the delta, what's happening up and down the system. So I would say at this point, maybe you'll find this with many of the folks who are interested in Floodmore, is that the regulatory process is probably 70% of the battle, and 30% would be how to work with your growers, where to put the water, how to bring it in safely, how to make sure that you use it, and so on. So that is where the locals need to work together. In our case, we have applied for a Floodmore application with the state board, which the state board saw it as programmatic. I thought it was problematic, but it was programmatic. So the reason is that because usually the state board is used to have a single stream going to a single farm. In our case, we have an application for Floodmore water where we capture the water as it happens and we distribute it. And again, paying attention to the facts, to the what does each and every watershed and stream can provide under the existing laws. But that's not what the state board is used to see. However, we think this is the only way you could capture water for the whole basin, and you put it in the right spot and you maintain sustainability. To do it on a one farm, trying to get water when they want it or they don't want it, this is an endless process. We have to look at it holistically. So MID, Merced Irrigation District, applied for this Floodmore application to look into. We know this is going to be a long process to move water, flood water from the streams and the river into the basin. And this is not an MID only project. It's the whole basin. So with that, an agreement was forged between all the parties, all the interested parties that in the basin, where we signed an agreement that that looked at how the water would be distributed beyond Merced Irrigation District. So as you had, this study is specifically for the district, but we are going beyond. So when you saw how much water we could recharge, that is only for Merced Irrigation District capability of recharge. But when you add another, the district is 130,000 acre feet. You could add another 200,000 acre feet in the basin, and you could tell that we could absorb all the water that we are allowed to take, and it would make a difference for the whole basin. and we put it in the right spot. So some places are NMID are not prone to recharge, but there may be other areas outside MID that are prone to recharge. So that's another thing that as part of this process. The other thing that came out of it is that people saw the benefit of working together and the potential of moving water from between the streams to areas that happen to be topographically down gradient from these streams, and projects start sprouting. So we have millions of dollars of projects for either connecting to Merced Irrigation District system or connecting to a creek to be able to take water as soon as the application is approved. And then also on top of that, the fast track process for an application for a single project is also happening to show that you could move water from one place to the other to the state board staff. So a lot of activities are happening here in the Merced Basin, and as we're looking at the challenges that we have, the concern that we have with what we call the water grab, with the water may be taken away from the district, the issue of sustainability becomes a true challenge, and every drop of water will count. So this is where we are on the local front with the regulatory side. And we have, like I said, projects that are actually happening on the ground. We did get grants, and we're going to do some pilot projects this year in areas that are close to in the subsidence region. So a lot of things are going on, and this study, we are going to use the concepts, the ideas out of these study, and then we'll fine tune them in the future to actually, like was mentioned, where we could hone in on the best combinations of options. I mean, so it's interesting how the study also suggests a combination of options, but once we kind of put the tires on the road, I guess, that's when we will find out how and the best options for, and it could be different for different areas of the basin. Another interesting piece of this FloodMar activities that we're having, not in our application for the FloodMar, not only we applied for areas within Merced groundwater basin, but also in the Turlock Basin, and we're doing that. We're doing that because we have water moving from the Merced Basin to the Turlock Basin on the east side of Turlock Basin, and when we're working on FloodMar, you have to look at all these, at all the potentials for alleviating existing stresses and also ensuring sustainability into the future. So that's what I wanted to share with you. And if you guys have any questions, I'll be more than happy.
Thank you, Hisham. We're going to do questions at a later session because we just don't have the time right now. But thanks for that perspective. That was really great.
I'm hoping that in the future, we'll give it maybe a year or so. Maybe MID will do a follow-up when we are implementing the study and show what we have accomplished and what worked and what didn't work. Hopefully everything works.
That would be great. Yeah, I would really look forward to that.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you, Sham. So we'll move to our last presenter, Jim Weeking. He's going to give us kind of a wrap up, some reflections, and next steps with the few minutes that we have left. So go ahead, Jim. Thank you, Hisham, again.
Thank you.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Hisham, for your thoughts. And I don't need to control the screen, Tommy. So maybe we can just advance to the next slide, and I'm just going to focus on next steps. And then this afternoon, when we get together and do our Q&A time, I'll take some time to do some reflections. But I did want to, at this point, extend a bow to a couple of groups of folks. And one is our incredible technical team. As you can all see, this is an amazing amount of work. We're doing integrated modeling in ways that are pretty innovative, pretty state of the art. We didn't get a lot of time on the climate change vulnerability results and modeling, but it is very much state of the art stuff. And we think that it's an important piece to help water managers, all sectors, better understand how we think important measures for their sector and for the other sectors perform into the future. So rather than just understanding, what are the general changes associated with climate change, we're going to provide some risk-based results that we think will help everyone kind of get on the same page about what we're up against with climate change. In terms of next step, and then the other group I want to bow a little bit to are the folks who have spoken up to this point. And I'll have some more to say to that about that this afternoon at our Q&A session. But I did want to highlight in terms of next steps that our executive at DWR and the Natural Resources Agency and then the legislature and the governor's office, they've been updated on what we're doing with the Merced study, and they like what they're seeing and they're enthusiastic about it. And so they have decided to fund 4 additional San Joaquin tributary flood-mar watershed studies, which we think of as an endorsement of what we're doing. And we're excited to be starting those. In fact, we're starting to meet with folks in the Calaveras watershed right now. And then we'll be moving on to the other studies as well over the next couple of years. So thanks again to our team, and thanks to all of you listening in, and we look forward to talking to you maybe a little bit more at 4:15. Orit?
Great, thank you. What an incredible team. What a great collaboration effort. Really appreciate hearing all the presentations. I was thinking about how in your presentation, you all really drilled down on the meaning of the hyphen in flood-mar, really seeing the connections and making the case of the importance of really strategically leveraging the interdependence when we're thinking about the physical infrastructure, reservoir reoperation, and on-farm recharge, and really putting all these pieces together. I was thinking also about Liz's presentation, really validating what we heard from Graham this morning about how local actions have regional implications, how we're expanding, how we're looking into it. The tent grows in lots of different dimensions. So really appreciating all the work that you have put into making these presentations really very accessible, and the story just flowed. And so a reminder that more detailed presentations are available on demand. I see some people have put some questions. We're going to come back to those at 4:15. Let's see, there were some questions about the presentations being available, and we will have those PowerPoint presentations available through the network SharePoint. And so you can reach to Jenny Marr to get access for that. That will take us a little bit of time after the forum, but we will have those stored there. So thank you to everyone. And we are going to reconvene at 2 o'clock to hear presentations about studies and projects, flood-mar projects. So please rejoin us through the website. I think Tommy is going to close this and we are going to restart at 2 o'clock. So enjoy your break, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And I'm going to stop share and we'll go ahead and end the meeting, and everyone have a great lunch. Hopefully see you at the afternoon session. Thank you.